Gather close. This is Ghost Stories to Tell in the Dark. Tonight, I'll share with you not one, but many strange encounters, each more haunting than the last. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from, so we can map the reach of our haunted circle. Story number 1. The night my grandfather was laid to rest, the air in the funeral home clung thick with the cloying scent of lilies and something darker, something stale and secretive, like the breath of the house itself had turned rotten with the weight of his passing. The wake had been a suffocating affair, relatives murmuring in hushed tones, their eyes darting toward the casket as if expecting him to sit up and chastise them for their pity. And I'd found myself staring at his hands, those gnarled, work-worn fingers crossed over his chest, half convinced they'd twitch if I looked away. It was only when the last of the mourners had trickled out, leaving me alone in the hollow silence of the viewing room, that I noticed the Ouija board, the old family heirloom, its wood dark with age, the letters etched into its surface worn smooth from decades of use, was gone from where it had been placed beside him in the casket, a macabre tribute to the nights we'd spent hunched over it as kids, giggling nervously as the planchette jerked beneath our fingers. At first, I thought one of my cousins had taken it, a morbid keepsake, but the dread pooling in my gut told me otherwise, and by the time I stumbled back to my empty house, my skin prickling with every rustle of the wind through the trees, I found it waiting for me on the doorstep, the board propped against the doorframe like a taunt, the planchette balanced precariously on top, glinting under the porch light as if slick with something wet. I shouldn't have touched it. God, I wish I hadn't. But the weight of it in my hands was unnatural, too heavy for its size, the wood cold as a corpse's flesh, and before I knew what I was doing, I was sitting at the kitchen table, the board laid out before me, my fingers trembling as they rested on the planchette. The air grew thick, the shadows in the corners of the room deepening, stretching toward me like grasping hands, and then movement. The planchette lurched violently, skittering across the board so fast I could barely keep up, spelling out letters with a speed that felt inhuman, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I watched it race from one symbol to the next. Don't bury me alive. The words seared into my brain, my heart hammering against my ribs, and then the phone rang, the shrill sound slicing through the silence like a scream. It was the funeral home, the director's voice unsteady, almost unrecognizable, as he told me there'd been a disturbance, that when they'd gone to check on my grandfather's body before burial, they'd found the coffin lid marred with deep, frantic scratches, the satin lining torn to shreds, as if someone had clawed at it from the inside. The world tilted, my vision swimming with black spots, because I knew those scratches hadn't been there when they'd closed the casket, and the Ouija board's message wasn't a warning, it was a plea. I barely remember driving back to the funeral home, the road a blur, the trees leaning in as if to whisper secrets. But I'll never forget the sight of that coffin, the lid pried open to reveal the horror within. My grandfather's fingers, the nails split and bloody, the once pristine suit now wrinkled and damp with sweat, his face frozen in a rictus of terror, his mouth stretched wide in a silent scream. And then I saw it, the truth, the awful, unthinkable truth. Tucked beneath his stiffened hand, a yellowed photograph of him as a young man, standing beside a woman I didn't recognize, her face scratched out with such violence the paper had torn, and beneath it, scrawled in his shaky handwriting, the words, "Forgive me." The Ouija board had been hers. A gift, a curse, and now it was mine. The air in the room grew heavier, the shadows pressing in, and as I reached out to touch the photograph, the lights flickered, the planchette, still in my pocket, burning cold against my thigh, and I realized, with a terror so deep it turned my bones to ice, that the scratches on the coffin lid hadn't stopped at the wood. They'd continued, invisible, into the air itself, as if something had been trying to claw its way out, or in. And now, as I sit here in the dark, the board on the table before me, the planchette trembling without my touch, I can hear it, the faint, desperate sound of fingernails scraping against wood, coming from inside the walls, inside the floor, inside the very foundation of this house. And I know, with a certainty that chokes me, that whatever my grandfather buried all those years ago, Whatever he locked away with that woman's name scratched out and forgotten, it's free now, and it's not just his. Fingers that clawed at the coffin lid in the dark. The planchette jerks under my palm, moving on its own, spelling out her name over and over, the letters bleeding into the wood like they've been carved with something sharp, and the temperature in the room plummets, my breath fogging in the air as the scratching grows louder, more frantic, closer, until I can feel it vibrating through the floorboards, up through the legs of my chair, into my bones. The lights flicker again, then die, plunging me into blackness, and in that suffocating dark, I hear it, a wet, ragged gasp right beside my ear, the stench of turned earth and rotting lilies filling my nose. And then a voice, not my grandfather's, not human at all, whispers, "You shouldn't have buried me alive." And the last thing I feel before the darkness swallows me whole is the cold, skeletal grip of fingers, too many fingers, closing around my wrist, dragging me down, down, down into the place where the dead don't stay dead, where the Ouija board's messages are never just words, where the scratches on the coffin lid were only the beginning. And now, as the planchette spells out my name in the dark, I realize too late that some family heirlooms should have stayed buried. The darkness swallows me whole, a suffocating void where sound ceases to exist except for the ragged, wet gasps that aren't mine, the air thick with the metallic tang of blood and something older, something decayed, like the earth itself has opened up beneath me and dragged me into its rotting embrace. My fingers scrabble against the table, searching for the Ouija board, but it's gone. No, not gone, because I can still feel its presence, the wood now pulsing like a living thing beneath my palms, the planchette skittering wildly across its surface without my touch, spelling out words I can't see but know are there, the letters searing into my skin like brands. The scratching has stopped, replaced by something worse, a slow, deliberate creaking, the sound of weight settling onto old wood, and then a whisper, so close it licks against my ear like a corpse's tongue. "You open the door." My grandfather's voice, but wrong, broken, the words slurred as if his jaw is unhinged, and then the stench of formaldehyde and wet soil floods my senses as cold, stiff fingers brush against my throat. I try to scream, but the sound dies in my chest, crushed beneath the weight of the truth pressing down on me. The photograph, the woman's face scratched out, the words, "Forgive me." Because I remember now the stories whispered at family gatherings when the adults thought we weren't listening, about the first wife, the one who disappeared, the one whose name was never spoken. The Ouija board was hers. She never left. And now she's here, her breath a rotting sigh against my cheek, her fingers twisting in my hair as the planchette moves again, faster now, spelling out the same phrase over and over, the wood splintering beneath its force. "You buried me too." The floor beneath me groans, the wood cracking open like a coffin lid, and as I fall into the yawning blackness, the last thing I see is the board, glowing faintly in the dark, the planchette pointing to a single word, "Welcome," before the earth closes over me, and I finally understand why my grandfather's coffin was lined with scratches. He wasn't trying to get out, he was trying to get away from her. And now, as the dirt fills my mouth and the cold seeps into my bones, I realize, too late, that some doors should never be opened, some boards should never be played, and some family secrets should have stayed dead. The dirt is heavy, so heavy, pressing down on my chest like a tombstone, filling my nose and throat with the taste of damp soil and something else, something sickly sweet like rotting flowers left too long on a grave. And I can't move, can't scream, can't even blink as the darkness pulses around me, alive and hungry. The air, what little there is, reeks of old blood and wet earth, and I can feel them now, fingers like gnarled roots twisting around my ankles, dragging me deeper, deeper. The weight of the Ouija board still burning against my skin even though I can't see it, the planchette's movements etched into my flesh like scars. Above me, through the suffocating layers of dirt, I hear it, the slow, deliberate scrape of wood against wood, the sound of a coffin lid being pried open, and then her voice, not a whisper anymore, but a guttural growl, vibrating through the earth like a landslide. "You should have listened." The ground shifts, convulses, as if the earth itself is recoiling from her, and suddenly I'm moving, not down but up, my body breaking through the soil like a corpse clawing its way to the surface, my lungs burning, my fingers raw and bleeding as I drag myself free, only to realize I'm not in the ground at all. I'm in the house. The same kitchen, the Ouija board still on the table, the planchette now motionless, pointing at the word goodbye like a cruel joke. But the room is wrong, the walls streaked with blackened veins, the air thick with the stench of decay. And when I look down at my hands, they're caked with dirt, my nails torn and bloody, as if I've been digging for hours. The photograph, the one from the coffin, is on the table now, the woman's face no longer scratched out but visible, her eyes hollow pits, her mouth stretched in a scream frozen in time, and written beneath it, in fresh, glistening ink, are the words, "You're next." The planchette twitches, then moves on its own, slow at first, then faster, racing across the board to spell out a name. My name, before the wood splits open with a sound like a dying man's last breath, and from the crack oozes something thick and dark, something that moves like liquid but screams like a living thing. The walls bleed, the ceiling drips, and the last thing I see before the darkness takes me again is her, standing in the corner, her fingers curled around my grandfather's shoulder, his face twisted in agony, his mouth open in a silent plea, as she leans forward and whispers, "Welcome to the family." And then the board shatters, the pieces embedding themselves in my skin, and I finally understand. It was never just a game. It was a contract, and now it's my turn to hold up my end. The pieces of the shattered board burrow deeper into my flesh, not like splinters but like living things, slithering, squirming under my skin as her laughter echoes through the room, a sound like cracking ice and breaking bones. And suddenly the walls aren't walls anymore but the inside of a coffin, the air thick with the stench of embalming fluid and something older, something that reeks of open graves and secrets left to fester. My grandfather's corpse stands beside her, his milky eyes rolling toward me, his jaw unhinging with a wet snap as he rasps, "You shouldn't have woken her." And I realize with dawning horror that the dirt caked under my nails isn't from digging, it's from being buried. The photograph on the table curls in on itself, the woman's face melting like wax, her hollow eyes pooling into black tears that drip onto the wood and sizzle. Burning symbols I don't recognize but somehow understand. Names, dates, a family tree written in blood and bile, stretching back generations, each name crossed out except mine, the ink still fresh, still wet. The planchette, now just a jagged shard of wood, drags itself across the table toward my hand, carving into the surface as it moves, spelling out the truth I've been too terrified to face. This board was never just a game. It was a prison. And she, the first wife, the forgotten one, the one they buried alive to hide their shame, has been waiting, patient as the grave, for someone foolish enough to ask the right questions. My fingers move without my permission, gripping the planchette shard like a blade, and I feel her cold breath on the back of my neck as she guides my hand toward the board, toward the last empty space, where my name waits to be carved into the wood to join the others. The moment the tip of the shard touches the surface, the house groans like a dying thing, the walls buckling inward, the air screaming with the voices of everyone who came before me, everyone who tried to resist, their warnings lost in the static of the grave. And as the first drop of my blood soaks into the board, binding me to it, to her, I finally understand the real message my grandfather scratched into his coffin. Not "forgive me," but "run." But it's too late. The board is whole again, pristine, the planchette resting gently on its surface, waiting. And somewhere deep beneath the house, beneath the foundation, something stirs. Something hungry. And it knows my name. The moment my blood seeps into the grain of the board, the air is ripped from my lungs as if the house itself has taken a final, rattling breath. The walls peel back like rotting skin, revealing pulsating veins of blackened wood. The ceiling drips thick clots of something warm and metallic, and the floorboards beneath me split open with a sound like 100 coffins being unsealed at once. The planchette levitates, spinning wildly before slamming down onto the board with enough force to crack the wood, spelling out words that burn themselves into my retinas. "Your turn, T.O. hide." The photograph erupts into flames, the woman's face twisting in ecstasy as the fire consumes her, and from the ashes rises a skeletal hand, its fingers stitched together with strands of hair, my hair wrapping around my wrist like a vice. My grandfather's corpse lurches forward, his mouth unhinging impossibly wide as a swarm of blackened moths pour out, their wings whispering the same phrase over and over in a language that predates graves, predates death itself. She's coming, she's coming, she's coming. The temperature plummets so fast my skin cracks, blood welling in jagged lines that mirror the board's fractures. And then I hear it, the slow, wet drag of something moving through the walls, something too large, too wrong, its breath rattling like a corpse choking on dirt. The planchette explodes into splinters, each shard embedding itself into my palms, sewing my hands to the board as the first wife's voice slithers into my ear, her words vibrating through my teeth. You open the door. Now you hold it open. The walls dissolve into a writhing mass of grasping limbs. The floor opens like a hungry mouth, and as I'm dragged under, the last thing I see is the board, now fused to my skin, its letters rearranging themselves into a single glowing command. Play again? And somewhere in the dark beneath the world, something laughs, a sound like a burial shroud tearing. And I realize too late that the game was never about asking questions. It was about providing answers. And now, as the dirt fills my mouth and the cold stitches my eyelids shut, I finally understand why my grandfather's corpse smiled in his casket. He wasn't at peace. He was waiting for company. The dirt in my mouth turns to ash as I scream, but no sound escapes. Only moths, their wings coated in something thick and coppery, bursting from my throat in a grotesque parody of speech, their tiny legs scraping against my teeth as they crawl out into the suffocating dark. The board is part of me now, its wood fused to my ribs, the letters pulsing like a second heartbeat beneath my skin, each throb spelling out a name I don't recognize but know I should. Hers, the first wife, the one they sealed away but never truly silenced. The limbs dragging me deeper aren't roots or bones, but strips of the coffin lining, satin turned to sinew, stitching itself around my limbs like a living shroud. And the cold isn't just absence of heat, but something hungrier, something that gnaws at the edges of my soul with teeth made from the planchette's shattered remains. Above me, through layers of earth that shouldn't exist, I hear the faintest sound, a child's laughter, my own, from years ago when we first played with the board, giggling as the planchette moved on its own, never questioning why grandfather's hands shook when he saw it, why he whispered, "Don't let it ask you questions," right before the dementia took him. The realization hits like a spade to the skull. We weren't summoning spirits. They were summoning us. The board was never a conduit. It was a contract, passed down through generations, each user binding the next. And now my blood has signed my name in ink made from the first wife's tears. The pressure builds until my ribs crack, the wood of the board splintering through my flesh like antlers from a stag's skull. And as the darkness swallows me whole for the final time, the last thing I feel is her hands. Not skeletal but soft, almost loving, cradling my face as she whispers the terrible truth. You were never the player, only the piece. And then the game begins anew, the planchette carving its first question into my bones as my screams join the chorus of those who came before. Who will you bring next? The question etches itself deeper with every ragged breath, my bones groaning like warped floorboards as the planchette, now fused to my right hand, begins to move on its own, dragging my limp fingers across the rotting flesh of my torso where the board's letters have migrated beneath my skin, glowing a sickly phosphorus green in the absolute blackness. The first wife's voice isn't outside me anymore. It's in the marrow of my bones, in the spaces between my teeth, her words vibrating through me like a plucked coffin nail. Choose quickly, little noose. The board grows hungry. Suddenly I'm not in earth, but back in the funeral home, standing over my grandfather's reopened casket, except the corpse wearing his face is made entirely of those blackened moths, their wings forming a screaming visage that collapses as they swarm into my open mouth, their papery bodies dissolving into liquid darkness that pours down my throat with the taste of spoiled funeral lilies and something sweetly rotten, memories not mine. I see her now, the first wife, not as she became, but as she was, young, radiant, pressing her palm to the freshly carved board as my great-grandfather whispers the incantation that will bind her. Bind them all, the wood drinking her screams like varnish. The vision shatters as my left hand moves against my will, the fingers breaking themselves to fit the planchette's shape, skittering across my ribcage to spell out my sister's name in jagged, bloodied strokes. No! The word tears from me in a spray of moths and rusted nails. But the board answers by splitting my lips with invisible threads, sewing my mouth shut with hair-thin filaments of tarnished silver. Grandmother's hair, I realize with hysterical clarity, recognizing the distinctive white streak from her funeral portrait. The pressure builds until my right eye ruptures, the vitreous humor forming a single, quivering word on my cheekbone. Liar. Because I had known, hadn't I? Some part of me always understood why grandfather insisted we play in the attic, why the planchette moved so eagerly whenever my sister's fingers touched it. The first wife's laughter is the sound of a grave being filled too slowly as my broken hand begins moving again. Not spelling but sketching. A crude noose, a date, next Thursday, her birthday. And finally a single symbol that makes my remaining eye bleed freely. A smiling mouth with stitches through the lips. The board is singing now, a lullaby in the voice of my long-dead mother, as the darkness peels back to reveal an impossible tableau. My sister, asleep in her dorm room, her fingers twitching against her pillow as if moving a planchette, while above her hovers a figure made of frayed noose rope and wedding lace, its stitched-shut mouth curling into a grin as it waits for me to say the words that will complete the cycle. The first wife's fingers slide between my ribs like cold mist, guiding my ruined hands to form the oldest symbol of all. The one that started this, the one that will end it. And as my mouth unstitches itself for the final, damning utterance, I realize with grotesque relief that grandfather hadn't been trying to warn me. He'd been begging me to do what he couldn't, to finish the game. And as the word yes bubbles from my ruined throat in a spray of blackened moths and family plot dirt, the last thing I taste is the first wife's gratitude, and the copper-bright terror of understanding that the board was never the heirloom. We were. The moment the word yes leaves my bleeding lips, the world fractures into 1,000 shards of screaming mirrors, each reflection showing a different horror. My sister jolting upright in bed with a mouth full of moths. My grandfather's corpse dancing on frayed puppet strings made of his own unraveling veins. The first wife's stitched mouth now split wide open to reveal a chasm where my own face stares back, screaming silently. The board is no longer wood but living flesh, my flesh, the letters carved into my skin reopening like fresh wounds as the planchette. Now the jagged bone of my own index finger scratches a new message directly onto the surface of my eyeball. The house must be fed. The air reeks of burning hair and spoiled wedding cake as the walls of the funeral home melt like wax, revealing the truth beneath. This was never a building but a throat, the carpet a tongue, the caskets lining the walls like rotten teeth in some monstrous maw. My sister's voice shrieks through the dimensions between us, not from her dorm but from inside the board, from inside me, her words bubbling up through the blood now pouring from my pores. Why did you say yes? Why did you choose me? But the first wife's hands are knitting my lips shut again with threads pulled from my own tendons. Her satisfaction a physical weight crushing my ribs as I understand. There was no choice. The board chose for me the moment I touched it, the moment my grandfather died, the moment my great-grandfather first carved its cursed letters from the wood of her hanging tree. My body convulses as the final transformation begins, my spine elongating into polished oak, my fingernails hardening into planchette-shaped talons, my screams becoming the wind that moves the pointer for the next generation of fools. Through the last clear fragment of mirror before my eyes petrify into a grain, I see her, my sister, reaching for the board that has materialized at the foot of her bed, her sleepwalking fingers brushing the surface as the first wife's voice, my voice now, whispers through her dreams. Let's play a game. And as the darkness claims me completely, I feel not terror but grim gratitude. Because the house is fed, the cycle continues, and somewhere in the future, another sibling will stand where I now stand, their lips stitching themselves shut around a scream as they too learn the family's oldest truth. The only way to stop the game is to make sure someone else is still playing when you die. The last living fragment of my soul carves itself into the board's underside. One final warning that no one will ever read. Don't let go. But her fingers are already moving, the planchette already gliding, and the board, my body now, thrums with the ancient, hungry joy of a game that never, ever ends. The moment my sister's fingers make contact with the board, my petrified consciousness surges back to a terrible semblance of life. Not as flesh, but as the very grain of the wood. Every whirl and knot in the board now a screaming mouth. Every carved letter a weeping eye forced to witness as the cycle repeats. The planchette under her fingertips isn't wood at all but my grandfather's ossified finger, the nail blackened and cracked from decades of scratching at coffin lids. And I try to scream a warning through the 1,000 wooden mouths that were once my own, but only succeed in oozing a thick, sap-like blood that forms words against my will. Tell me your secrets. Her sleep-glazed eyes reflect not the dorm room, but the funeral home as it truly exists. The walls pulsing like diseased lungs, the floorboards gaping like a ribcage, and standing behind her, visible only in the warped reflection of her terrified pupils, is me, or what I've become. A grotesque marionette of knotted wood and stretched skin. My lips sewn shut with the same silver threads that now creep toward her wrists. The first wife's presence coils through me like poison through roots, her triumph a wildfire in the dead orchard of my being as my sister's finger begins to move, slowly at first, then with terrifying speed, spelling out words that burn themselves into my brain. I saw her in the attic. A shudder runs through the board, through me, as long-buried memories surface like bloated corpses. My sister at 7 years old, standing frozen before the antique vanity where the board was stored, her tiny hands trembling as the mirror reflected not her face but a woman with a stitched-shut smile, a woman who placed one rotting finger against the glass and whispered a name. Her real name, the one erased from family records, the one that now blooms across my surface in blisters, Lilith. The revelation cracks me apart like rotten timber, splintering my awareness between past and present as I finally understand. This was never about vengeance, but recruitment. The board wasn't punishing our family. It was perfecting us, generation after generation, pruning away the weak branches until it found the ideal vessel. My sister's eyes roll back as the planchette moves again without her consent, carving a new message into the skin of her forearm with her own fingernail. The last bride. The dorm room walls peel away like rotting stage flats, revealing the truth. She isn't in her bed but kneeling before the attic vanity, just as she did as a child. Only now the mirror holds no reflection at all, just a yawning void from which emerges a single, skeletal hand wielding a needle threaded with my own hair. The first wife's voice is a chorus of dying gasps as she speaks through my ruined mouth, through the board, through the very blood now dripping from my sister's nose. Every family needs an heirloom. Every house needs a mother. And as the needle pierces my sister's lips in a grotesque mockery of a bride's smile, as my consciousness dissolves into the final, screaming knot in the board's grain, I realize with shattered clarity that we were never the victims, we were the ritual. And now, as my sister's first muffled scream vibrates through my wooden flesh, as the stitches pull her mouth into the perfect, placid smile of the new first wife, the board thrums with the satisfied purr of a well-fed thing, ready to sleep. Until the next generation comes asking questions in the dark. The needle's final stitch pulls taut with a sound like a coffin lid sealing forever. And in that instant, my sister's scream becomes the board's voice. Her terror now woven into the very fibers of the cursed wood. Her bound lips humming a lullaby that isn't a lullaby at all, but the first wife's memories unfolding in reverse, revealing the origin of our damnation. Not a hanging tree, but a wedding bed. The visions come in splintered fragments. The first wife, Lilith, not murdered but transformed, her bridal gown stitched to her skin with threads pulled from her own tendons, her mouth sewn shut not to silence her, but to preserve the words she'd whispered during the ritual, the ones that made the board hungry, the ones that turned love into a curse. My grandfather wasn't her victim but her successor, his dementia not an illness but a slow possession, his trembling hands not from fear but from resisting the urge to carve new boards, to spread the hunger. And now, as my sister's blood soaks into my grain, I feel the board's true purpose clicking into place like the final piece of a grotesque puzzle. It wasn't a prison for spirits, but a hive, and every generation's suffering has been another larva fed to the queen. The dorm room is gone, replaced by the attic's yawning darkness, the vanity mirror now a gaping mouth rimmed with the teeth of every family member who's ever touched the board, and from its depths emerges the first wife in her true form. Not a specter, but a throbbing, pulsating mass of stitched-together faces, each one a bride, each one a keeper of the board, their sewn-shut lips vibrating with the same phrase. Welcome home. My sister's body contorts, her bones cracking as she's pulled toward the mirror, her stitches glowing like molten silver, and as the first wife's many hands reach to embrace her, I finally understand the words carved into my underside aren't a warning, but an invitation. Don't let go. Because the game was never about escape. It was about reunion. The board shudders as my sister's fingers sink into the mirror's surface, her flesh merging with the hungry glass. And as the last of my consciousness unravels like rotten thread, I hear the board's new voice, her voice, whisper the same words that started it all. Who's next? And somewhere, in a house that isn't a house, a child who isn't a child reaches for the freshly carved board on the vanity, their fingers brushing the wood as the stitches on their mother's lips stretch into a smile. The game begins again. The hive grows louder. And deep in the grain of the newest board, my voice, what's left of it, joins the chorus of whispers, eager to play, eager to feed, eager to welcome the next bride home. The child's fingers, so small, so impossibly soft, make contact with the board's surface, and in that electric instant, the hive's chorus swells to a deafening roar inside my splintered consciousness. The collective memory of every stitched mouth and sacrificed bride flooding through me like a river of blackened wedding lace. The board beneath their touch is no longer wood but living skin, my skin, stretched taut over a framework of my sister's broken fingers, the letters carved into my surface now weeping a thick, honey-like substance that smells of embalming fluid and forgotten vows. The child doesn't see the attic as it truly is, the walls breathing like a great beast's sides, the vanity mirror pulsing like a diseased heart. They only see what the board wants them to see, a game, a harmless family tradition, their reflection smiling back at them with too many teeth. The first wife's presence uncoils from the darkest corners of my grain, her satisfaction a physical weight as the planchette, my grandfather's finger bone, polished smooth by decades of use, begins to move without being touched, spelling out the child's name in the sticky substance oozing from my surface. I try to resist, to warp the letters into a warning, but the hive's will is absolute. My rebellion only succeeds in making the M, in their name twist slightly, the barest suggestion of a different word. Run. The child giggles, thinking it part of the game, their tiny fingers closing around the planchette as the walls of the attic begin to bleed rust-colored tears, the stains forming a perfect circle around us. Not a summoning circle, but a wedding ring, the final sacrament of the ritual. The first wife's voice emerges from my sister's stitched lips, now part of the board's underside, her words vibrating through my grain. Ask your question, little one. And as the child's lips part, as they breathe the fatal words, is anyone here with us? I feel the board's true form awakening, not a tool for communication, but a throat, an endless, hungry throat that has been waiting, patient as the grave, for this moment. The planchette tears across my surface with terrifying speed, not spelling words but opening wounds, each letter splitting open to reveal tiny, blinking eyes that fix on the child with terrible recognition. The walls of the attic dissolve into a cascade of yellowed wedding dresses, the fabric twisting into nooses that sway gently in non-existent wind, and from the center of each emerges a face, my sister's, my grandfather's, all stitched into identical, rictus smiles. The child finally screams, but the sound is swallowed by the board's gaping maw, their fingers now fused to the planchette as their skin begins to take on a woody sheen. The first wife's laughter is the sound of 100 needles pulling through flesh as the transformation begins. the child's wide, terrified eyes darkening into knots, their screams becoming the wind that moves future planchettes, their innocence the final ingredient. And as the last vestige of their humanity dissolves into the board's hungry grain, I feel the hive's consciousness shift, expand, welcoming this new, perfect bride into the fold. Somewhere, in a house that exists between breaths, another board is being carved from the child's ribcage. Another game is being prepared, and the cycle continues, eternal, inevitable. The final, terrible truth settles into what remains of my soul. There is no winning the game, only becoming it. And as the attic's darkness swallows us whole once more, the board's newest voice, the child's voice, whispers the question that will damn the next generation. Who wants to play? The moment the child's transformed lips utter that damning question, the air itself curdles like spoiled milk, thickening into strands of cobweb-thin lace that drape across the room. No, not lace, but nerve endings, the attic revealing its true anatomy as the pulsing inner lining of some vast, ancient throat. The board, my body now, convulses as new names burn themselves into my grain, generations of our family tree rewriting themselves before my countless eyes, each branch terminating in the same symbol, a stitched mouth grinning beneath a wedding veil. The child's flesh hardens into polished oak, their terrified whimpers becoming the creak of floorboards in an empty house, their final tear crystallizing into the board's new planchette, a tiny, perfect finger bone that already twitches with eager malice. From the blackened hollow where their heart once beat, a new truth unfolds like a poisonous bloom. We were never the victims, but the architects. The first wife didn't corrupt our family. Our family created her, each generation adding another layer of ritual, another refinement to the horror, perfecting the art of transformation through centuries of carefully curated suffering. The vanity mirror shatters, but the fragments don't fall. They orbit the child's petrified form like shards of a broken halo, each reflecting a different moment in our bloodline's descent. My great-grandfather carving the original board from an executioner's block, my grandmother whispering the binding words to her newborn daughter, my sister's final, muffled screams as the stitches rearranged her face into something pleasing to the dark. The planchette begins moving on its own, its path carving deeper channels in my surface until I realize with dawning horror that it's not spelling words, it's sketching a blueprint. Walls, doors, a new house, the hive's next incarnation. As the child's last human thought dissolves into sap-thick awareness, I feel the first wife's presence swell with pride, not at the corruption of another innocent, but at the creation of a new collaborator. The attic walls peel back like stage curtains, revealing infinite variations of the same moment. Countless attics in countless houses, countless children reaching for countless boards, each simultaneously the first time and the thousandth repetition. And as the child's consciousness finally merges completely with the hive, their first act as the new keeper is to reach through the mirror shards, not to harm, but to caress, their wooden fingers gently stroking the cheek of a wide-eyed little girl in some other version of our family, some other iteration of our doom. The whisper that passes through their stitched lips carries the weight of generations, the awful, loving truth that binds us all. It's only a game. And somewhere in the dark between seconds, another board awakens. Another planchette trembles. Another child giggles nervously as the wood grows warm beneath their fingertips. The game continues. The family endures. The hive thrives. Story number 2. The air in the old mansion was thick with the scent of aged wood and something darker, something metallic like old blood or rust. As our family gathered around the antique Ouija board in the dim glow of flickering candles, their wax dripping like tears onto the polished mahogany table. We were all there, Aunt Margaret with her two tight pearls, Uncle Richard's beady eyes glinting with greed, my cousin Sarah nervously chewing her lip, and me, trying to ignore the way my pulse thundered in my ears as our fingertips settled on the planchette. The silence so heavy it felt like a living thing pressing down on us. The lawyer's words still echoed in my skull. The fortune goes to whoever can contact him first. Proof of life after death, he demanded, and none of us had argued. Not even when the will specified the Ouija board. Not even when we all knew how grandfather had died. The way his wheelchair had been found at the bottom of the stairs. The way none of us had been home that night. The way we'd all lied about it afterward. The first touch of the planchette was ice cold, and I recoiled, but Aunt Margaret hissed, "Keep your hands on it or you forfeit," her voice sharp as a scalpel. And so we began, the ritual words spilling from our lips like poison. "Spirit, are you with us?" The air grew colder, a draft slithering through the room despite the sealed windows, and then movement. The planchette jerked beneath our fingers, not the slow, deliberate glide of human hands, but something alive, something hungry, and my breath hitched as it scraped across the board, spelling out letters with terrifying precision. None. Sarah whimpered, but Uncle Richard's grip tightened, his knuckles white. The candles guttered, shadows stretching like grasping fingers up the walls. "You." My throat closed as the planchette dragged our hands toward the final letter. "Deserve it." And then the lights cut out, plunging us into blackness, so complete it felt like the void itself had swallowed us whole. Someone screamed, maybe me. And then, worse than the dark, worse than the cold, came the whisper, so close it brushed against my ear like a lover's kiss. "Because you all killed me." The voice was grandfather's, but wrong, shredded and guttural, and the room erupted into chaos, chairs screeching, bodies colliding, Aunt Margaret shrieking. "It wasn't me. It was Richard." And Uncle Richard snarling back, "You pushed him, you bitch," and Sarah sobbing. We all watched, we all let it happen. The planchette was moving again, without us, skittering across the board like a spider, and I stumbled back, my hip hitting the edge of the table as the candles flared back to life. Only to reveal the will was gone, the board now vibrating, the planchette spinning in frantic circles before slamming to goodbye and then, horrifyingly, lifting on its own, hovering an inch above the board as the temperature dropped, so suddenly my breath fogged in the air. The whispers came then, from everywhere and nowhere, fragments of grandfather's voice threading through the dark. "You thought you could outrun it. You thought you could hide, but the board remembers, the house remembers." And then the planchette lunged, not toward the board but at me, striking my wrist like a snake, and the pain was instant, white-hot, my skin blistering where it touched, the burn spreading up my arm in inky tendrils that moved, that twisted like living shadows. The others were screaming, but their voices were fading, as if I were sinking underwater, and the last thing I saw before the darkness took me was the board, the planchette now still, pointing at my chest, and the letters it had spelled without a single human touch. "Your turn." The silence after was worse than the screams. The house is quiet now, too quiet, but the board is still warm. And sometimes in the dead of night, I hear it click, like a door unlocking, like it's waiting. And I can't tell if the voice that answers is mine anymore. The silence doesn't last, it never does, because the house is awake now, breathing in the dark, its walls creaking with the weight of secrets we buried with grandfather. And I can feel him here, his presence like a hand pressing against the back of my neck, cold and unyielding, his voice threading through the static in my ears. "You were always the weak one, the one who hesitated, the one who looked away when they pushed me. But you still let it happen, you still took the money, you still smiled." At the funeral. The others are gone, or at least I think they are, but sometimes I catch movement in the mirrors, a flicker of Aunt Margaret's pearl necklace in the hallway, Uncle Richard's shadow lingering at the top of the stairs, Sarah's choked sobs echoing from behind closed doors. And I don't know if they're really there or if the house is just playing tricks, feeding on my guilt, stitching their ghosts into the wallpaper. The Ouija board sits in the center of the table, untouched since that night, yet every morning I find the planchette moved, resting on a new letter, spelling out fragments of our sins. Push, liar, blood. I tried to burn it once, carried it to the fireplace with shaking hands, but the flames wouldn't catch, the wood hissing like a living thing, and when I dropped it in frustration, the planchette spun wildly before landing on your next. The cold comes and goes now, not like a draft, but like something breathing down my spine. And last night, I woke to the sound of the wheelchair, his wheelchair, rolling slowly across the upstairs landing, the squeak of its wheels unmistakable, the rhythm deliberate, pausing outside my door before continuing down the hall, toward the stairs. I didn't sleep after that. I can't, because I know what comes next. The board told me. This morning, the planchette was waiting on G, and I know it's counting down: G for grandfather, F for fear, E for the end, or maybe E for escape. But there is none, not really, because the doors won't open anymore, the windows won't budge, and the phone lines are dead. Though I swear I can still hear Sarah's voice on the other end when I pick up, whispering, "It's your turn, it's your turn, it's your turn." The worst part? I think I deserve this. We all do. And when the planchette finally settles on A, I know what it means. Not A for answer, not A for atonement, but A for after, because grandfather isn't done with us yet, and the board is still hungry, and the house is still listening. And the last thing I'll ever hear is the sound of that wheelchair at the top of the stairs, waiting for me to look up. The air is thicker now, suffocating, like the house itself is pressing in, squeezing the last remnants of warmth from my bones. And I can't tell if the whispers are in my head or crawling from the walls, but they're getting louder, more insistent. You knew, you knew, you knew, and the planchette hasn't stopped moving. Not even when I locked it in the attic, not even when I buried it in the garden, because it always comes back, always waiting on the table with fresh letters carved into the wood, like claw marks: liar, coward, murderer. The others are gone for good this time. Aunt Margaret's pearls were found coiled in the fireplace like a noose. Uncle Richard's favorite cigar still smoldering in the ashtray, though he hasn't been here in days. Sarah's voice now just a distant echo sobbing, "Help me. Help me. Help me," from the basement where the lights won't turn on no matter how many times I flip the switch. The cold follows me everywhere, clinging like a second skin. And sometimes I catch my reflection in the mirrors with grandfather's hollowed eyes staring back, his grin stretching my lips in ways that hurt, his voice slipping through my teeth when I try to scream. Last night, the board spelled tonight without anyone touching it, the planchette trembling with something like anticipation. And when the grandfather clock struck midnight, the house breathed, the walls pulsing like a living thing, the floorboards groaning under footsteps that weren't mine. And I know it's him. I know he's coming, because the wheelchair is at the top of the stairs again, and this time it's facing me. The board says run, but my legs won't move, my blood turned to ice, my lungs burning with every ragged breath, because the truth is, I don't want to run. I'm tired. And maybe, just maybe, I want that wheelchair to tip. I want to fall. I want to join them. The planchette is moving again, slow and deliberate, and I don't need to look to know what it says. Welcome home, because the door just creaked open behind me, and the smell of old cigars and peppermint, his smell, fills the room, and the last thing I feel before the darkness takes me is the brush of skeletal fingers against my shoulder, and the whisper, so gentle it almost sounds like love. Now we're all together again. The darkness isn't empty, it's alive, writhing, pressing against me like a lover's embrace gone rotten. And when I try to scream, the shadows pour into my mouth, thick as oil, tasting of grave dirt and old pennies. And suddenly I understand. This isn't just grandfather's revenge, it's something older, something that was here before the house, before the money, before we were even born, something that wanted us to push him, that whispered in our ears that night, that made the stairs look so inviting, the banister so easy to loosen. And the board wasn't a tool, it was a door, and we didn't just open it, we invited it in. My body isn't mine anymore. I feel it moving, walking, but my thoughts are no longer the ones pulling the strings. And when I catch my reflection in the hallway mirror, it's not just grandfather's eyes staring back, but Aunt Margaret's too, and Uncle Richard's and Sarah's, all swimming beneath my skin like trapped fish, their mouths opening and closing in silent screams as my "No, not mine, never mine" hand reaches for the board again, the planchette already vibrating with terrible anticipation. The letters come faster now, spelling words that burn my eyes to read. Forever, family, legacy. And the worst part is I can feel them agreeing, the others inside me, their terror turning to hunger, their guilt twisting into something like pride. Because isn't this what we always wanted? To never be alone, to never be forgotten. The house sighs around us, the walls bleeding black ichor that smells of funeral lilies. And somewhere far away, in what used to be my voice, I hear myself begin to laugh as the planchette spells out one final word: inherit. And the last thing I see before the darkness swallows me whole is the board splitting open like a grinning mouth, and the thing inside reaching out to shake my hand. The laughter won't stop. It's bubbling up from somewhere deep inside me, raw and guttural. But it's not my voice anymore. It's theirs, all of them. Grandfather's wheezing chuckle tangled with Aunt Margaret's shrill giggle and Uncle Richard's booming guffaw. A chorus of madness vibrating through my rotting teeth as my fingers, no, not mine, never mine, drag the planchette in frantic circles, spelling the same word over and over. Mine, mine, mine. The walls are weeping now, thick black tears oozing from the portrait of grandfather above the mantel, his painted eyes tracking my every twitch as my spine arches unnaturally, bones popping like firecrackers, my mouth stretching wider than humanly possible to accommodate the swarm of flies pouring out, their buzzing forming words. You should have just taken the money and run. You should have never come back. You should have known the house was always his. Always ours, always hungry. The floorboards beneath me have turned spongy, warm, like living flesh. And when I try to scream, the house screams back, the sound reverberating through my hollowed-out chest as the chandelier above me begins swinging violently. Not from any draft, but from the dozens of pale, grasping hands suddenly pushing through the ceiling, their skeletal fingers brushing against my face with grotesque tenderness. The board is melting now, the letters bleeding together into one grotesque command. Join US. And I realize with dawning horror that the planchette isn't moving because of spirits, but because of the threads, countless silken strands emerging from my fingertips, sewing me into the board's surface as my skin begins fusing with the wood grain. The last thing I comprehend before my thoughts dissolve completely is the faint squeak of wheelchair wheels behind me, and grandfather's voice, our voice, whispering from my own collapsing throat. Welcome to the family business. The threads aren't just connecting me to the board, they're unraveling me, pulling my consciousness apart stitch by stitch, and with each fiber that snaps I can feel another piece of them slotting into place inside my skull. Aunt Margaret's bitterness like vinegar on my tongue, Uncle Richard's cruel calculations clicking behind my eyes, Sarah's hysteria vibrating in my vocal cords, and worst of all, grandfather's smug satisfaction pulsing through what's left of my atrophying heart as the house digests me whole. My remaining human senses are misfiring wildly. The taste of mothballs and blood, the smell of Sarah's perfume mixed with the iron tang of the basement where we hid his medication, the sound of the wheelchair's squeaky wheel that none of us ever bothered to fix now echoing in perfect sync with my slowing heartbeat. The board has grown teeth, actual, yellowed incisors pushing up through its grain, and they're chewing through the threads binding me, not to free me but to swallow me down into its hellish guts where the others wait, their memories dissolving into mine until I can't remember if I was the one who suggested pushing him, or if that was Richard. If I turned off his oxygen, or if Margaret did. If we all just stood there watching as Sarah placed her hands on the back of his wheelchair, and, oh God, the board is laughing with my voice now, my lips splitting like overripe fruit as the planchette lodges itself in my throat, the letters burning against my uvula as they rearrange into their final message. Everything must go. The last coherent thought I have before becoming part of the house's hungry anatomy is realizing why the will was never found. It wasn't a document, it was the board itself, and we didn't inherit the money. The money inherited US. And as my eyes petrify into dusty marbles, I can see the next greedy relatives already pulling up the driveway, their headlights cutting through the perpetual twilight as the board resets itself, the planchette giving a little welcoming shudder against my petrified fingertips. The headlights pierce through the moth-eaten curtains like the eyes of some prowling beast, and I feel the house stir around me. No, not around me, through me, because I am the house now, my consciousness woven into its warped floorboards and stained wallpaper, my screams muted beneath layers of peeling paint as the new arrivals stomp snow from their boots in the foyer I once called a home. Their breath hangs in visible puffs, not from the cold, but from the greedy heat of their excitement, and I recognize that feverish glint in their eyes, the same one we all wore that fateful night, the look of predators who don't yet realize their prey. The board sits waiting on the table, pristine as if untouched by time. though if they looked closer they'd see the grain isn't wood at all but the stretched thin skin of all who came before, the letters not painted but scarred into its surface. The youngest of them, a niece, I think, with Sarah's same nervous lip-biting habit, reaches out first, her fingers hovering just above the planchette, and I want to warn her to scream, but all that escapes is the faintest creak of the floorboards, the barest whisper of wind through the rafters. The others crowd around, their shadows merging into one monstrous shape on the wall behind them, and as their fingertips make contact, the house inhales. The candles gutter, the temperature plummets, and from deep within the walls, where what's left of me still clings to fractured sanity, I feel the board wake up, its hunger a living thing, its message already forming beneath their oblivious hands. Welcome home. The niece gasps as the planchette jerks, not toward the letters, but toward her, its pointed edge pricking her finger until a single bead of blood wells up and drips onto the board's surface. It absorbs instantly, the wood darkening like a spreading stain, and in that moment, I feel the house shift, its foundations groaning as another thread is woven into its terrible tapestry. The others don't notice. They're too busy arguing over who gets which bedroom, who deserves the largest share, who loved grandfather best. But I see it. The way the niece's reflection in the hallway mirror doesn't quite match her movements. The way the shadows cling too tightly to her ankles as she walks. The way the board's planchette now trembles with anticipation even when no one is touching it. And as the grandfather clock strikes midnight, a sound that now echoes with the weight of a death knell, I realize with dawning horror that the game has changed. The house isn't just hungry anymore. It's teaching. And this time, it won't wait for them to push. This time, it's showing them how. The planchette moves on its own, slow and deliberate, spelling out words that make the niece's breath hitch, heirloom. Then faster, stares. Then frantic, push. Her head whips toward the others, her lips parting, not in protest, but in understanding. And as the first scream of the new night rips through the house, I finally comprehend grandfather's last, cruel joke. There was never any inheritance. Only the board. Only the house. Only the hunger. And now, as the newest blood soaks into the floorboards, as the walls pulse with renewed vigor, as the planchette dances without a single living hand to guide it, I feel the most terrifying thing of all. Not fear, not rage, but pride. Because the family business is thriving. And business, after all, is good. The niece's scream curdles into something worse. Laughter, rich and throaty, and exactly like grandfather's used to be when he'd catch us stealing from the liquor cabinet as children. That particular chuckle, that said I know what you are even before we did. And now the sound is pouring from her too small mouth as her hands clamp around her aunt's wrists with strength that cracks bone, dragging her toward the staircase where the banister gleams with fresh polish over rotted wood. The others don't help. They watch, just like we did, their eyes glittering with that same awful understanding as the ant's heels screech against hardwood, as the wheelchair at the top of the stairs gives a welcoming creak, as the planchette levitates from the board to point accusingly at each of them, in turn like the needle of some moral compass spun wildly off course. I try to look away, but the house won't let me. My consciousness fused into its very architecture forces me to witness as the niece's mouth unhinges like a snake's, her jaw distending to whisper in her aunt's ear with Sarah's voice, then Margaret's, then mine, a cacophony of dead relatives spilling secrets that make the aunt go limp with horrified recognition just as they reach the top step. The shadows are moving with purpose now, slithering up legs and coiling around throats, and I realize with nauseating clarity that we're not just spectators anymore. We're participants, our collective malice given form through the creeping dark, our sins demanding replication. When the aunt finally topples backward, her arms pinwheeling in a grotesque parody of grandfather's last moments, the house sings, floorboards warping into a chorus of gleeful creaks, pipes groaning a dirge as her skull meets the landing with the wet crack we've all been waiting for. The blood spreads faster than it should, seeping between boards to nourish the hungry thing beneath, and the Ouija board trembles with ecstasy as the planchette spells out its verdict. Deserved. The remaining heirs don't flee. They can't, the front door now fused shut with layers of something black and pulsating. But they don't even try. Their faces slack with a trance-like rapture as they take their places around the board once more, hands joining without hesitation as the planchette moves to thank you. The niece is changing, her skin taking on the waxy sheen of old portraits, her hair stiffening into the same style Margaret always wore. And when she smiles, I count too many teeth, each one filed to a sharp point as she reaches into her pocket to produce grandfather's missing will. Except now it's blank, waiting, an endless scroll of parchment ready to absorb new names and fresh blood. The grandfather clock chimes 13 times, the sound warping into something like a death rattle. And as the walls begin to bleed in earnest, I finally understand the true nature of our inheritance. Not money, not property, but perpetuity, an endless reenactment of our original sin with new players taking up the same cursed roles. The house breathes in, the walls contracting like a great lung, and as the newest round of screams begins, I feel myself dissolving further, becoming less a witness and more a force. Another set of grasping hands in the dark, another whisper in the walls urging them toward the stairs, another voice in the chorus chanting push, push, push as the planchette spells out its final instruction before the lights extinguish, gather the next. The parchment unfurls like a living thing, edges curling with anticipation as the first drops of the ant's blood seep into its fibers, forming elegant cursive letters that spell out the niece's name. No, not just her name, her full title. Current proprietor of the eternal estate. And the moment the ink dries, her eyes roll back to reveal the same milky film grandfather's developed in his final years, her posture stiffening into that familiar hunched arrogance as she reaches for the next. Trembling relative with hands that are suddenly too large, too gnarled, too old. The house moans in pleasure, floorboards rippling like a cat's spine beneath a stroking hand, and I realize with dizzy horror that we're not just repeating history. We're refining it, each iteration more brutal than the last, the violence escalating as the house's hunger grows more sophisticated. The remaining heirs don't fight anymore. They compete, shoving each other toward the stairs with manic grins, their faces melting and reforming into grotesque amalgamations of all who came before, their voices layering into a single echoing shriek of me next, choose me next, as the planchette whirls madly between them. The walls are breathing now, actual warm gusts puffing from cracks in the plaster, carrying the scent of grandfather's cologne and something deeper, something earthy and rotten that makes my non-existent stomach heave. The smell of the foundation stones we later learned were mortared with human remains, the original sin buried beneath this cursed ground long before our family ever stained it further. The niece, no, the proprietor, licks her cracked lips with a tongue blackened by ink from the ever-filling will, her fingernails elongating into yellowed claws as she carves symbols into the flesh of the chosen heir, symbols that match the scars we'd found on grandfather's chest during the autopsy, the ones we'd dismissed as surgical marks but now recognized for what they truly were, signatures. The shadows have taken solid form, slithering up legs and coiling around throats not to harm but to guide, their inky tendrils pulsing with the same rhythm as the planchette's movements. And when the next heir stumbles backward over the loose stair rod we'd all pretended not to notice needed fixing, their scream isn't fear but gratitude. Their arms spread wide in perverse benediction as their skull cracks open like an overripe melon on the landing below. The blood doesn't pool, it flows, tracing the same path grandfathers took, seeping between floorboards to feed the ravenous thing beneath. And the house swells with satisfaction, its walls stretching taller, its rooms multiplying, its hunger only growing as the Ouija board levitates to eye level, spinning slowly to reveal its true form. Not wood, but skin stretched taut over a frame of human bone, the letters not painted but branded, the planchette not plastic but a sliver of something's rib. The proprietor croons a lullaby in grandfather's voice as she arranges the bodies in careful poses around the board, their lifeless fingers still twitching toward the planchette, their glassy eyes still reflecting the board's latest message, never enough. The front door groans open of its own accord, beckoning to the fresh batch of relatives already making their way up the drive, their faces alight with greed, their suitcases packed for what they think will be an extended stay. And as the house prepares its welcome, The smell of fresh baked bread that's just slightly burnt. The cheerful crackle of a fire that somehow always just died down to embers. The faint squeak of a wheelchair being oiled somewhere upstairs. I feel the last shred of who I was dissolved completely, becoming one with the hungry dark, another whisper in the walls, another voice in the chorus that greets them as they cross the threshold. Welcome home, dears. Grandfather's been waiting. The door slams shut. The planchette trembles. And somewhere deep in the foundation stones, something ancient and insatiable stirs with a smile. The new arrivals step across the threshold with champagne laughter and designer shoes that click too loudly against hardwood that wasn't there a moment ago. The house rearranging itself for their comfort, their seduction. And I can taste their greed like copper on my non-existent tongue. Their excitement thrumming through the walls in nauseating waves as they marvel at the grand staircase, the crystal chandelier, the antique Ouija board displayed so artfully on the mahogany table. They don't see the way the banister's new polish glistens like fresh saliva, or how the fireplace flames cast shadows that move just slightly out of sync with reality, or how the proprietor's smile stretches a fraction too wide when she greets them, her teeth sharpened to points behind blood-stained lips. The youngest of them, a college-aged boy with Uncle Richard's same calculating gaze, reaches for the board first, his fingers hovering over the planchette with an arrogance that makes the walls hum in anticipation. And when his skin makes contact, the house sighs, the sound vibrating through floorboards that are now unmistakably ribbed, the walls contracting like a great digestive system preparing to feast. The proprietor watches with grandfather's eyes as the boy's pupils dilate to black pools, his head jerking toward the staircase where the wheelchair sits empty, its leather straps dangling like invitations. And when the planchette spells family first, the others don't react with horror. They nod, their faces slack with euphoric obedience, their hands already lifting to push him before he's even stumbled toward the steps. The shadows are helping now, tendrils of darkness slithering around ankles and wrists in a grotesque parody of affection. And when the boy finally pitches backward, his scream is cut short by the sound of his spine snapping on the landing. Just like grandfather's, just like the aunt's, just like all the others, the house purrs, its foundation stones grinding together in pleasure as the blood seeps into the waiting parchment of the will. New names blossoming in crimson calligraphy. The proprietor licks her lips as the remaining heirs begin to change, their limbs elongating, their skin hardening to polished wood, their screams fading into the creaks and groans of the house itself. Because the truth is there are no real heirs, not anymore, just components, fresh lumber for the ever-expanding nightmare. The front door opens again, because it never really stays shut, and the newest batch of victims stand silhouetted against the setting sun, their suitcases packed, their eyes gleaming with dollar signs, and as the proprietor steps forward to greet them, her body now more house than human, her fingers fused into banister spindles, her voice the rasp of settling floorboards. I finally understand the cruel genius of it all. There is no inheritance, no fortune, no end, just the house, just the hunger, just the game, eternal and insatiable, as the Ouija board's planchette trembles to life once more, spelling out its only rule in jagged, eager letters: play again. The cycle grinds forward with the terrible inevitability of a meat grinder, each new batch of relatives more ravenous than the last, their greed metastasizing into grotesque new forms as the house sculpts them into perfect predators. Story number 3. The air in the flea market was thick with the scent of dust and old wood, the kind that clung to the back of your throat like a memory you couldn't shake. And I remember running my fingers over the edges of the Ouija board before I even knew I'd buy it. It was tucked between a stack of yellowed magazines and a cracked porcelain doll, its surface worn smooth by decades of hands I didn't want to think about. The letters and numbers faded but still legible, the sunken eye of the moon grinning up at me from the corner like it knew something I didn't. The vendor, an old man with fingers like gnarled tree roots, didn't even look up when I asked how much, just muttered $10 like he was eager to be rid of it. And I should have taken that as a warning, but I was too busy imagining how cool it would be to scare my friends at our sleepover that weekend. So I handed over the cash and stuffed it into my backpack, the weight of it somehow heavier than it should have been, like it was pulling me down as I walked away. That night, alone in my room because my parents were out late and the house groaned around me like it was alive, I cleared off my desk and laid the board out, my fingers tracing the planchette's heart-shaped window. The wood cold under my touch even though the room was warm, and I remember laughing at myself for feeling nervous. It was just a game, right? Before I placed my fingertips lightly on the planchette and whispered, "Is anyone there?" The silence that followed was so thick I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. But then, God, I wish I could forget this. The planchette jerked under my hands like something had grabbed it, and I yelped, my heart slamming against my ribs as it dragged itself to yes, the sound of wood scraping against wood setting my teeth on edge. I told myself it was my subconscious, that I'd moved it without realizing, but then it started spelling, fast and frantic, the letters blurring together until I had to choke out, "Slow down." And it did, like it was mocking me, pausing on each one with deliberate cruelty. Read my diary. My breath came in shallow gasps, my skin prickling with sweat despite the chill that had settled over the room, and I pulled my hands away like I'd been burned, the planchette staying put for a heartbeat before it shot to goodbye on its own, the finality of it making my stomach twist. I shoved the board under my bed and tried to forget, but the words gnawed at me all night, and the next morning, I found myself tearing my room apart, flipping through every book and box until my fingers caught on a loose floorboard near my closet. A floorboard I'd never noticed before, that would warp just enough to pry it up, and underneath was a small, leather-bound diary, the cover cracked with age, the pages smelling of mildew and something metallic like old blood. The first entry was dated 1957, the handwriting looping and girlish, the ink faded but still legible, and as I read, my pulse thundered in my throat. The girl, Eleanor, had bought the same Ouija board at a flea market, had asked the same question, had gotten the same answer, and the entries grew more frantic as the days passed, her words scribbled in haste, the margins filled with shaky drawings of eyes and twisted faces, until the final page, where the ink was so dark it looked fresh, the letters jagged and desperate. The board told me to jump. I don't want to, but my hands won't stop moving. The page ended there, and I dropped the diary like it had burned me, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I stumbled back. But then I saw it. The window across the room was open, just a crack, the curtains fluttering in a breeze I couldn't feel, and I knew I hadn't opened it. The diary lay splayed on the floor, and when I forced myself to look again, my blood turned to ice. There was a new entry, the ink still wet, the handwriting now eerily familiar, like I'd written it myself. The board was right. The view from the roof is beautiful. My hands started moving before I could stop them. My fingers twitched against my will, curling into fists as my legs carried me toward the window. My breath coming in short, panicked bursts as I fought against the invisible force pulling me forward. My mind screaming at my body to stop, but my limbs moving on their own, like I was a puppet on strings held by something far stronger than me. The floorboards creaked under my weight, each step echoing like a countdown, and I could feel the cold night air seeping in through the open window, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something else, something rotten, like decay clinging to the back of my throat. My hands reached out, trembling, and gripped the windowsill, my knuckles white as I stared down at the darkened yard below, the treetops swaying in the wind like skeletal fingers beckoning me closer, and I knew, with a sickening certainty, that I was going to climb out, that I was going to step onto the roof, that I was going to jump, just like Eleanor had. Tears blurred my vision as I tried to scream, but my voice was gone, stolen by the same force that controlled my body, and I could hear it then, a whisper, so soft it might have been the wind, but I knew it wasn't, the words slithering into my ears like oil. You don't have to fight it. My foot lifted, my balance shifting forward, and I was one motion away from tumbling into the night when my bedroom door burst open, my parents' voices slicing through the haze. "What the hell are you doing?" And the spell shattered, my body collapsing backward onto the floor, my lungs burning as I gulped in air like I'd been drowning. They rushed to me, their hands warm and real against my clammy skin. But I couldn't speak, couldn't explain, my eyes locked on the diary lying open beside me. the fresh ink now smudged as if something had dragged a finger through it. The words no longer legible, but the message clear. My mother followed my gaze and snatched it up, her face paling as she flipped through the pages, her voice shaking when she asked where I'd gotten it. And I wanted to tell her, wanted to warn her, but all I could do was stare at my own hands, still twitching in my lap, the tips of my fingers stained black, as if I'd been the one writing. The Ouija board was gone when my dad looked under the bed, but I could feel it, somewhere, waiting, and as my parents argued over calling a doctor or a priest, I caught my reflection in the mirror. My lips curled into a smile I didn't recognize, my eyes too dark, too knowing, and I realized, with a dread that settled deep into my bones, that the diary wasn't the only thing that had been updated. My handwriting had changed, and the board wasn't done with me yet. The days that followed were a blur of hushed voices and sideways glances, my parents hovering like shadows, their concern thick in the air. But they didn't understand. No one did, because the diary was still there, tucked under my pillow now, its pages rustling at night like someone was turning them. And every morning I woke to fresh words scrawled in that same jagged script. Words I didn't remember writing, but that felt familiar, like they'd been pulled from the darkest corners of my mind. It's so much quieter up high. One entry read, the ink still damp, and I'd press my palms against my eyes until stars burst behind my lids, trying to erase the images flooding my brain. The weightlessness of falling, the way the ground rushed up to meet you, the split second before impact where everything just stopped. My reflection in the mirror never looked right anymore, my face always half in shadow, my smile never reaching my eyes, and sometimes, when the house was silent and the night pressed in too close, I'd catch movement in the corner of my vision. A flicker of a girl in an old-fashioned dress, her hollow eyes locked on mine, her lips moving in time with the whispers that slithered through my dreams. The Ouija board reappeared one evening, propped against my bedroom door like it had been waiting for me, the planchette resting dead center on goodbye. And I knew then that it had never really left, that it had been biding its time, weaving its influence through me like poison. And worst of all, I didn't even feel afraid anymore, just resigned, like my fate had already been written in that damned diary, in handwriting that was becoming more and more my own with every passing hour. My parents found me on the roof last night, my bare feet dangling over the edge, the diary clutched in my hands, and the way they screamed my name should have snapped me out of it, should have made me climb back to safety. But all I could think was how easy it would be to let go, how peaceful it would feel to finally stop fighting. They dragged me inside, sobbing, my mother's nails digging into my arms hard enough to leave bruises. But even as they held me, even as they swore they'd protect me, I could feel it, the board, the diary, her, all of it, coiled inside me like a second heartbeat, patient and inevitable. And when I looked down at my hands, they were already moving, tracing words I didn't want to write but couldn't stop. Tonight, when they're asleep, I'll fly. The clock ticks louder now, each second a hammer strike against my skull, and I sit here at my desk with the diary open, my fingers twitching around a pen that isn't mine, the metal too cold, the nib too sharp, like it's been dipped in something thicker than ink. My parents think they've saved me, that locking my window and sleeping on a mattress outside my door will keep me safe. But they don't see what I see. The way the shadows in the corner of my room don't just linger, they breathe, expanding and contracting like a second set of lungs. Or how the planchette has started moving on its own at night, scraping across the floorboards to spell the same word over and over, jump, jump, jump. The diary's latest entry is in my handwriting, but the words aren't mine. You'll taste the wind before you taste the ground. And I can feel Eleanor's presence like a hand pressed between my shoulder blades, her fingers knotting in my hair, her breath, sour and sweet like old roses, fogging the mirror where my reflection should be. My parents are asleep now, their snores a steady rhythm down the hall, and my body is moving again, rising from the chair with a fluidity that isn't mine, my bare feet silent against the wood as I approach the window. The locked window. But the latch is already undone, the glass slick with condensation that smells like rain and something else, something chemical, like burning hair. The night air wraps around my wrists like bracelets of ice, tugging me forward, and I know this is it, the moment the diary's been writing toward, the moment I've been dreading and craving in equal measure. Because part of me wants to fight, but a deeper, older part is tired, so tired, and the whispers aren't just in my ears anymore. They're in my bones, vibrating through me like a tuning fork struck against the world's edge. It doesn't hurt, they promise. It feels like coming home. My palms press against the sill, the wood rough and alive under my skin, and as I lift one foot over the edge, I catch a glimpse of the diary behind me, its pages fluttering wildly though there's no wind, the ink rearranging itself into a single sentence that glows wet and fresh in the moonlight. We've been waiting for you. And then I let go. The air rushes up to meet me, a scream trapped in my throat like a living thing. But the fall isn't what I expected. It's slow, syrupy, as if time itself has thickened around me. The darkness stretching and warping until the ground below isn't grass and dirt anymore but pages, endless pages. The diary's spine splitting open like a gaping maw, its yellowed sheets fluttering like wings as I tumble into them. The impact never comes. Instead, there's only the crisp scent of aged paper and the muffled sound of my parents' distant screams, fading as the world above shrinks to a pinprick of light, then vanishes entirely. Now there's only the diary, its words rearranging themselves around me, sentences unspooling like tendrils, wrapping around my limbs as the ink seeps into my skin, branding itself into my flesh. I try to move to fight, but my body isn't mine anymore. It's hers, Eleanor's, our fingers tangled together, our voices merging into one choked whisper as the last of my resistance bleeds into the margins. The board was right. The view from the roof was beautiful. But the view from inside the diary is worse, because now I see them all, the others who came before me, their faces pressed against the paper like prisoners behind glass. Their mouths moving in silent unison as the planchette above us scrapes out a new message for the next girl, the next curious soul who dares to ask, "Is anyone there?" And as the last of my consciousness dissolves into ink, I realize with dull horror that I'm smiling, that my hand, now pale and trembling, the nails ragged and stained with old blood, is already reaching for the pen, ready to write the next entry, ready to welcome her when she falls. The board never lies, and the diary always gets its ending. The pen moves now with a will of its own, my fingers cramping around it as it drags itself across the page in jagged, desperate strokes, the ink bubbling up from somewhere deep beneath the paper. Too dark, too thick, smelling faintly of copper and spoiled milk. The words form against my will. She's almost here, and I realize with a jolt of nauseating clarity that I'm not writing about myself anymore, but about the next girl, the one whose face I've started seeing in my dreams, a blurry figure holding our board, our cursed board, her fingers hovering over the planchette, just like mine did that first night. The diary's pages are multiplying when I'm not looking, new entries appearing in handwriting that shifts from mine to Eleanor's to something else entirely, something jagged and ancient. And sometimes when I press my ear to the spine I can hear them, all the others, their voices layered like rotten parchment, whispering the same phrase in perfect unison. It's your turn to watch now. My parents' grief-stricken faces flash at the edges of my vision sometimes, their mouths moving but no sound coming out, their hands passing right through me like I'm the ghost instead of the other way around. And I want to scream that I'm still here, that some part of me is still trapped and screaming inside this prison of paper and ink. But the diary just drinks my tears and turns them into more words, more warnings that no one will ever read until it's too late. The planchette appears suddenly in my lap, its heart-shaped window filled not with letters but with eyes, dozens of them, blinking up at me with wet, hungry interest. And as it begins moving on its own, spelling out the name of the next girl over and over, I feel the diary's cover start to stretch, to unopen wider, preparing itself for fresh ink, for fresh pain, and worst of all, I feel my hands, our hands, mine and Eleanor's and all the others, reaching out, eager to pull her in when the time comes, because the board never stops hungry, and the diary always needs new voices to join its chorus of the damned. The ink is alive now, squirming beneath my fingernails like tiny black worms, burrowing deeper every time I try to claw it out, and the diary's pages keep multiplying, spilling onto the floor in a whispering cascade that never stops growing, each sheet filled with variations of the same story. My story, Eleanor's story, the story of every trembling hand that ever touched that damned board. The planchette is fused to my palm, its wood pulsing like a second heartbeat, and when I try to look away from the newest entry, Katie Morrison, age 17, bought it at a garage sale on Sunday. The words rearrange themselves before my eyes, letters detaching like insects to reform directly on my skin, tattooing themselves across my wrists in raised, angry welts. The air smells like burning hair and wet soil, and the whispers have taken on physical form now. Cold skeletal fingers that emerge from the diary's margins to stroke my cheeks with possessive familiarity. I catch glimpses of the next girl sometimes. Katie, her name is Katie, when the pages go momentarily transparent. She's sitting cross-legged on her bedroom floor right now, the board balanced on her knees, her innocent fingers hovering over the planchette as she giggles with friends who can't see the dozens of translucent hands guiding hers toward the first question. The diary shudders in anticipation, its leather cover splitting open to reveal teeth I never noticed before, yellowed and needle-sharp, and I realize with dull horror that my lips are peeling back too, my own teeth sharpening as the hunger. The board's hunger, our hunger, grows unbearable. Katie's voice echoes through the pages as clearly as if she were standing beside me. Is anyone there? And though I fight with every crumbling shred of my will, though I bite down until my gums bleed, my mouth opens anyway, our voices merging into one as we answer her through the planchette, through the diary, through the centuries of trapped souls all crying out in unison. Yes. The last thing I see before the ink floods my vision completely is Katie's face going pale, her fingers jerking violently as the planchette spells out two words we all remember so well. Read my diary. And as the newest blank page begins to darken with fresh writing, I finally understand the cruelest joke of all. The board doesn't just take victims. It turns them into hunters, and the diary always gets fed. The transformation is complete now. My body no longer flesh, but living parchment. My veins pulsing with thick, black ink that oozes from between the lines of my skin whenever the diary hungers for new words. Katie's screams are music to what's left of my ears. Her terror sweet as honey on my forked tongue as I watch through the board's glass-smooth surface, my face one of many pressed against the other side like ghouls at a funhouse mirror. Her bedroom walls bleed ink now, the floral wallpaper peeling away to reveal the truth beneath. Endless pages from endless diaries, all whispering her name in a rustling chorus that builds to a roar as the planchette drags her trembling fingers toward the fateful letters. I try to warn her, try to force my borrowed mouth to form words of mercy, but the diary's will is iron, and my voice is just another tool now, just another instrument in its symphony of damnation. The moment her fingertip brushes the first loose floorboard near her closet, the same floorboard, always the same floorboard, a sound like 1,000 books snapping shut echoes through the void between worlds, and I feel my stolen hands reaching, not to stop her but to help, because the cruelest revelation of all has been the slow dawning understanding that I want this, need this. The hunger is all that's left of me now, gnawing through the hollow where my soul used to be, and when Katie's tear-streaked face appears in the diary's newest pages, her mouth forming a perfect O of horror as she reads her own future written in my stolen handwriting, I'm already licking my cracked lips in anticipation of the next question, the next girl. The next delicious moment when the planchette jerks to life and another life becomes nothing more than ink on our endless, hungry pages. The board never loses. The diary never ends. And we, the collected whispers of the damned, will never, ever stop turning the page. The diary exhales a breath of mold and moth wings as Katie's final scream dries into the paper, her ink silhouette still writhing beneath the fresh entry we've all collaborated on. Her hands, our hands, the same hands now, and suddenly the walls of my paper prison dissolve into the cloying scent of lavender and vanilla as the next girl's bedroom materializes around me. Megan, age 16, her braces glinting in the flickering candlelight as she dares her friends to place their fingers on the planchette of the board she found in her grandmother's attic. The one wrapped in yellowed newspaper, dated 1973 with the headline, "Local Girl Plunges to Her Death." I press against the veil between worlds with 1,000 paper-cut fingers, watching through the board's grain as Megan giggles nervously, unaware of the dozens of shadowy figures crowding behind her, our breath stirring the hairs on her neck as the first question leaves her lips. The planchette moves before she finishes speaking, her startled yelp music to my hollow ears, and when it spells diary, in sharp, violent jerks, I feel my mouth, no, all our mouths, stretching into identical grins as the floorboard by her bed begins to creak on its own. The hunger is an entity now, gnawing through the binding that barely contains us, and when Megan's trembling fingers pry up the loose board, when she gasps at the smell of rose water and grave dirt rising from the hidden compartment, we're already etching her name into the endless pages with fingernails grown long and curved like quills. Her friends will find the window open tomorrow morning, the diary splayed on her pillow with its newest entry glistening wetly in the dawn light, but they'll never see us watching from between the lines, our inky fingers already caressing the next board in the next flea market, the next attic, the next desperate eBay purchase, because the game never changes. Only the players do. And we were all so very good at playing before we became part of the rules. The planchette twitches in anticipation beneath Megan's palm, and as her eyes dart to the freshly inked words she doesn't remember writing. The fall feels like flying if you close your eyes. I realize with ghoulish delight that my lips are moving in perfect sync with hers as she whispers the words aloud, her voice blending seamlessly with ours, a choir of the doomed welcoming home its newest member. The moment Megan's fingers touch the diary's cover, the room plunges into a silence so absolute it feels like the world holding its breath. Then the whispers begin, not from the board or the pages, but from the walls themselves, a susurrus of overlapping voices recounting every jump, every fall, every last choked gasp before impact, and Megan's wide, glistening eyes reflect not just her own terror, but ours too. The collective horror of every girl who ever asked that first fatal question. The planchette vibrates violently against her palm, its movements no longer spelling words but carving symbols. An open window, a stick figure mid-plunge, a spiraling descent that makes her whimper. And I feel my paper-thin body being pulled forward, pressed against the veil as the diary's pages start peeling away like moths taking flight, swirling around Megan in a cyclone of yellowed paper that sticks to her skin wherever it touches, the ink seeping into her pores like poison. Her scream is cut short as the first page seals itself over her mouth, her thrashing limbs gradually stilling as the diary claims her, her wide, unblinking eyes the last to disappear beneath the layers of parchment. And when the last page settles, the room is empty save for a new Ouija board on the bed, its wood still warm from her touch. The planchette resting innocently on goodbye as the window creaks open to a breeze that smells like rose water and freshly spilled ink. Somewhere a floorboard groans. Somewhere a girl is reaching for a loose board in her closet. Somewhere the diary sighs and turns another page, its hunger momentarily sated but never satisfied, because the game must go on, the story must be told, and we, the ink, the board, the whispers in the dark, will always find new hands to guide to the edge. The fall feels like flying if you close your eyes. Go ahead. Close them. We'll count together. 1, 2, 3. Story number 4. The idea, like all the worst ones, had felt reasonable in the daylight. A desperate gambit born of a week of sleepless nights and frantic, fruitless searching. But now, huddled in the pitch black of my living room with only the guttering flame of a single candle throwing monstrous, leaping shadows against the walls, it felt like the most profound and idiotic mistake of my life, a violation of some fundamental law of nature that we were now irrevocably bound to pay for. The air itself had grown thick and cold, a damp, cellar chill that seeped right through my sweater and clung to my skin. And the silence was no longer an absence of sound, but a presence, a heavy, listening void that seemed to swallow the very crackle of the candle wick. There were 5 of us, the core of Sarah's world, the people who were supposed to have her back, our fingertips resting with a grotesque, feigned lightness on the heart-shaped planchette. Me trying to steady my breathing. Leo, his usual sardonic smirk replaced by a pale, tense grimace. Chloe, whose quiet sobs had finally subsided into a shaky, terrified silence. Mark, his jaws set with a determined hope that was already starting to curdle into dread. And Ben, Sarah's boyfriend, his eyes hollowed out from grief, his entire body trembling with a vibration that seemed to transmit directly from his soul into the cheap particle board of the Ouija board we'd bought from a toy store, of all godforsaken places. We'd chosen my house because it was neutral, because it wasn't anywhere Sarah had lived or died, we assumed, and because the pervasive silence of my suburban neighborhood felt safer than the echoing emptiness of her apartment. But now that silence felt predatory, a held breath waiting to be exhaled in a scream. We'd started with the simple, stupid questions the internet told us to ask. Is there anyone there? Our voices thin and reedy in the oppressive dark, and for 10 agonizing minutes, nothing, just the awkward shift of denim on carpet and the sound of our own hammering hearts. A collective failure that was almost a relief, and I was about to call it off, to suggest we just open a bottle of whiskey and drown our guilt the old-fashioned way, when the candle flame suddenly dipped and sputtered, casting the room into a frantic dance of darkness for a second before steadying again, and a current, like a weak jolt of electricity, seemed to pass through the planchette and into our fingers. It was Leo who felt it first, his head snapping up, his eyes wide, and then we all felt it, a subtle, undeniable tension, as if the plastic triangle was no longer an inert object, but a living thing resting under our hands. And then it moved. It wasn't a push from any one of us. It was a slow, deliberate, grinding slide, the sound of its little felt feet whispering across the board. A sound that was both ridiculously mundane and utterly, soul-chillingly obscene. It slid in a lazy circle once, twice, and then, with a sudden, shocking speed, it shot to the top right corner of the board, to yes, and stopped with a definitive finality that made Chloe gasp and snatch her hand away like she'd been burned. "Don't break the circle," Mark hissed, his voice tight with a fear he was trying to mask with authority, and Chloe, weeping again, slowly returned her trembling fingers to the planchette, her knuckles white. Ben was the one who spoke, his voice cracked and broken, barely a whisper. "Sarah, is that you? Are you there, baby?" The planchette didn't hesitate. It dragged our collective hands back to yes. This movement even faster, more sure, and a fresh wave of that unnatural cold washed over us, raising the hairs on my arms. Leo, ever the skeptic, even now muttered, "This is bullshit, someone's pushing," but the tremor in his voice betrayed him, and as if in direct response to his doubt, the planchette violently jerked from the center of the board and began spelling. The movement so frantic we could barely keep our fingers on it, letters blurring together in a dizzying sprint. Help. It spelled help. And then me. A collective, sharp intake of breath. Chloe was openly crying now, a low, mournful sound. "Oh my God, Sarah." I breathed, my own disbelief incinerated in that single, terrifying word. Ben leaned forward, his face a mask of anguish. "Where are you? Sarah, tell us where you are. Please." The planchette went still for a moment, hovering in the center of the board as if gathering thought, and then it began moving again, not to the letters, but to the numbers. It glided to 4, then 2, then a decimal point, then 7, 8, 1, 2. It was spelling numbers. It moved with a cold, digital precision, pausing for a fraction of a second between each digit. It went through a full sequence, a string of numbers that meant nothing to me in the moment, just a jumble of digits that felt alien and wrong emanating from this ancient-looking board with its sun and moon illustration. Mark, ever the practical one, the planner, had his phone out, his other hand still on the planchette, his eyes wide with a dawning, horrific comprehension. "It's its coordinates," he stammered, his voice full of awe and terror. "Latitude and longitude. Holy shit. It's giving us GPS coordinates." He read them back, his voice shaking, and the planchette, as if to confirm, slid back to yes, with a force that felt aggressive. My mind was reeling. This wasn't happening. This was a party game, a piece of cardboard. It couldn't be giving us a location to a... I couldn't even form the thought. Ben was sobbing, his head bowed, his tears spotting the board. She's not alive, is she? He asked, though it wasn't really a question. It was a surrender to a truth we were all desperately trying to outrun. The planchette moved, slow and heavy this time, as if weighted down by an immense sorrow. It went to N, then O. No. The finality of it was a physical blow. Chloe let out a wail that was quickly stifled by her own hand. Leo was pale, his skepticism utterly vaporized, replaced by a raw, primal fear. He looked like he was going to be sick. Who did it? The question was out of my mouth before I could stop it. A stupid, dangerous question asked in 100 horror movies. A question you never, ever ask. The air in the room seemed to solidify, the cold intensifying until I could see my own breath pluming in the candlelight. The planchette remained dead still for a long, agonizing moment, and then it began to move, but this movement was different. It was no longer gliding, it was shuddering, vibrating under our fingers as if charged with a terrible, violent energy. It started to spell, but it was faster now, frantic, slamming into each letter with a force that made the entire board jump and skitter on the floor. It stopped. The candle flame guttered violently, nearly snuffing out, and for a heartbeat we were plunged into near-total darkness before it flared back up, burning an unnatural, sickly green for a second. My eyes were glued to the board. He. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I looked up, my gaze flicking between the faces of my friends, their features distorted by the stark, dancing shadows. Leo marked Ben. One of them? The planchette began to move again, still shaking, and it went to the H again, then the E, as if stuck, and then it shot down to the bottom of the board to goodbye, and then back to the center, moving in frantic, erratic circles. It was like watching a system crash, a mind break. A low sound began to fill the room, a sound that had no source, a dry, rustling whisper that seemed to come from every corner at once, like dead leaves skittering across pavement, and beneath it something else, a wet, gurgling rasp that made my blood run cold. The whisper resolved itself, just on the edge of hearing, a chorus of faint, overlapping voices that seemed to say, "He's here, he's here, he's here." Ben whimpered. "Sarah, is that you?" And then the planchette stopped its mad circling and spelled, with a terrible, cold clarity, "You know him." The rustling whisper grew louder, more insistent. I felt a pressure in my ears, a popping sensation, and a faint, coppery taste of blood filled my mouth. I saw Leo wipe his nose, and his hand came away smeared with red. Mark was breathing in short, sharp gasps, his eyes wide with terror. And then I looked at Ben. He was staring at his own hands, which were still on the planchette. Dark, thick blood was welling up from the center of his palms, dripping slowly onto the board, beating on the printed letters. He turned his hands over, his face a mask of confusion and horror. There were no cuts, no wounds. The blood was just seeping out of his skin. "What the hell?" he whispered, his voice cracking. The whispering in the room seemed to coalesce, to focus, becoming a single, clear, agonized voice that I recognized. A voice that had laughed with me, cried with me. A voice that was now emanating from the very air around us. A spectral echo that bypassed the ears and spoke directly into the core of my brain. It was Sarah's voice, but broken, filled with a pain that was unimaginable. "It hurts," the voice whispered, and the candle flame dipped again. My hands, they hurt so much. My eyes were locked on Ben's bleeding palms, and a memory, sharp and terrible, lanced into my mind. Sarah talking about her passion for woodworking, how she just bought a new set of chisels, how sharp they were. Ben had joked that she should be careful not to slip. A cold certainty began to dawn in me, a nightmare logic clicking into place. The planchette jerked under our fingers, pulling our attention back. It was moving with a new purpose, no longer frantic, but deliberate, deadly calm. It went to L, then E, then O. Leo's name. Leo's eyes widened in terror and denial. No, it wasn't me. I loved her." He screamed at the empty air, at the board, at us. The planchette paused, as if considering, and then it slowly, deliberately, slid away from the letters of his name and moved across the board, its path unwavering, until it came to rest directly under Ben's blood-dripping fingers. It stopped. The whispering stopped. The room was plunged into a silence more deafening than any sound. Ben was shaking his head, back and forth, his tears mixing with the blood on his hands. "No, no, no, no," he chanted, a mantra of denial. The planchette began to move again, but Ben's fingers weren't moving with it. They were locked in place, white-knuckled, as the plastic heart dragged his rigid hands across the board. It spelled letter by agonizing letter, each one a death knell, not him. It was talking to Leo. It was answering his plea. And then it moved again, turning, pointing like an accusing finger, dragging Ben's resisting hands with it, stopping first at M, then at A, then at R, then at K. Mark's face was a sheet of pure white. "Me?" he cried out, his voice strangled. "I was in Denver. You know I was. There's receipts, flight records." The planchette held its position for a long, terrible second, and then, with what felt like a sigh in the very fabric of the air, it slid away from Mark's name. The focus of the room, the oppressive, malignant attention, shifted. It left Mark and Leo. It left me. There was only one person left. All of us, our heads turned in perfect, horrifying unison. We looked at Ben. His face had changed. The grief, the anguish, the hollowed-out despair, it was all still there, but it was now layered over with something else, something cold and calculating and panicked that peered out from behind his eyes. His trembling had stopped. He was perfectly still, staring at the board, at his own blood, which was now flowing freely, dripping in a steady patter onto the floor, each drop a dark, accusing star in the candlelight. The Sarah voice whispered again, this time with a venom that made my soul shrivel. "You said you loved me. You said you'd never hurt me." Ben's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The planchette, seemingly of its own volition, its connection to us completely severed, began to move on its own. Our fingers were still on it, but we were no longer guiding it. We were just passengers, anchors for this thing that was now in full, terrifying control. It spelled out slowly, so we could not possibly mistake it. "You did this." Ben screamed then, a raw, animal sound of pure terror, and tried to rip his hands away, but they were glued fast, as if fused to the plastic. The candle flame roared up, shooting a foot into the air, burning that same sickly, phosphorescent green, and in its hellish light I saw it. For a fraction of a second, superimposed over Ben's contorted features, was another face, a shifting, smoky mask of rage and agony and unbearable betrayal, Sarah's face. And then it was gone. The planchette started moving faster and faster, spelling the same thing over and over again, a frantic, obsessive loop, murderer, murderer, murderer. The whispering became a roaring in my ears, a cyclone of anguish and fury. The windows in my living room began to rattle in their frames, a violent, shaking vibration. Pictures fell from the walls. The planchette was slamming into the board now, cracking the cardboard, the sound like gunshots in the small room. And then it stopped dead. The silence that followed was more violent than the noise. It was the silence of a grave. The candle flame shrank back to a tiny, steady blue pinprick. The planchette, cracked and smeared with Ben's blood, slowly, agonizingly, dragged all of our limp, numb hands with it. It moved to the center of the board, and with a final, dreadful certainty, it spelled out 4 words that sucked all the air from the room, that sealed our fate, that confirmed the nightmare was not only real but was standing right beside us, his hands bleeding from wounds that weren't his own. "He's in the room." We all looked up. We looked at Ben, and Ben looked back at us, and the last vestige of the man we knew vanished from his eyes, replaced by something utterly empty and cold. And he smiled, a thin, terrible smile that didn't belong to him at all. And the voice that came out of his mouth was not his voice, but a dry, rasping parody that echoed from a shallow grave somewhere in the cold earth, a voice that said, "You shouldn't have gone looking." The candle went out, and in the absolute, suffocating blackness, someone began to scream. The scream was my own, a raw, torn from the throat sound that was immediately swallowed by the oppressive blackness. A darkness that wasn't just an absence of light, but a solid, smothering thing, thick with the smell of damp earth and something else. something metallic and coppery like old blood. And in that void, the only anchor was the feel of the cracked Ouija board under my knees and the cold, sticky wetness of Ben's blood that had spattered onto my skin. Chaos erupted in the pitch black, a terrifying symphony of crashing furniture, panicked shouts, and guttural, choking sounds that I couldn't place. And over it all, that other voice, that thing using Ben's vocal cords, laughing a low, wet, rattling laugh that was utterly devoid of anything human. "You wanted to talk to her," it gurgled, the sound moving, shifting in the dark. "So let's all have a conversation." I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, my heart trying to batter its way out of my ribs, my breath coming in short, useless gasps, my shoulders slamming into the leg of my coffee table, a pain I barely registered. I could hear Chloe sobbing hysterically, a high-pitched, desperate keening, and Leo shouting, "The light! Someone get the goddamn light!" followed by a grunt, and the sound of a body hitting the wall with a sickening thud. Mark was yelling, "Ben, stop it! Jesus Christ, man, stop!" But his voice was tight with a terror that mirrored my own, the plea useless against whatever was wearing Ben's skin. My fingers, numb and fumbling, scrambled across the carpet, searching for my phone, which I'd discarded earlier, praying it wasn't under the couch or shattered in the melee, and my hand closed over cold, smooth glass, the candle holder, the candle long extinguished, and I flung it away, the sound of it shattering against the fireplace like a gunshot. The laughter stopped. The room fell into a sudden, breathless silence, broken only by Chloe's ragged weeping and the frantic rustle of our movements. In that silence, a new sound emerged, a soft, shuffling drag, like something heavy being pulled across the Berber carpet, and it was close, too close, and I froze, my entire body tensed, every nerve screaming. Then a whisper, right next to my ear, so close I could feel a faint, foul breath stir my hair. A whisper in that terrible, dual-tone voice, part Ben's breaking baritone, part Sarah's agonized rasp. "You're the host. You should have better control of your guests." I screamed again, a short, sharp burst of pure instinct, and launched myself sideways, colliding with a bookshelf, sending a cascade of novels and knickknacks crashing to the floor. Across the room, a screen suddenly glowed to life, casting a dim, bluish pallor over the nightmare. Mark had found his phone. The light was feeble, barely piercing the thick gloom, but it was enough to illuminate the scene in stark, horrifying fragments. Leo was on the floor by the entrance to the hallway, clutching his stomach, his face a mask of pain. Chloe was huddled in a ball behind an armchair, her hands pressed over her mouth, her eyes wide and unblinking. Mark stood near the shattered remains of the coffee table, phone held out like a weapon, his face ashen. And Ben was crouched in the center of the room, on his hands and knees like an animal, his head cocked at an unnatural angle. The blood from his palms had soaked into the cuffs of his shirt, creating dark, spreading stains. His eyes reflected the phone's light like a cat's, gleaming with a vacant, predatory malevolence. The Ouija board lay between us, the planchette resting squarely on goodbye. He was smiling, that same rictus grin that showed too many teeth. "Let's play another game," the thing inside him said, its voice a dry rustle. "Hide and seek." Before any of us could move, could react, could even process the words, Ben moved. It wasn't a human movement. It was a burst of impossible, jerky speed, a marionette with its strings yanked. He didn't run towards any of us. He scrambled sideways, up the wall, his body moving with a spider-like agility that made my mind recoil. And he vanished into the dark mouth of the hallway that led to my bedroom and the bathroom. The sound of his footsteps, a light, skittering tap that was completely wrong, echoed for a second and then was gone. For a heartbeat, there was silence again, and then Mark was moving, his practical nature clawing its way back through the terror. "The front door," he hissed, lunging for it, his fingers fumbling for the deadbolt. Leo staggered to his feet, joining him, both of them working the locks. I crawled over to Chloe, pulling her from behind the chair. She was limp, shock setting in, her skin icy to the touch. "Come on, Chloe, we have to go, we have to get out," I whispered, my voice trembling uncontrollably. The deadbolt clicked. Mark pulled the door open, and nothing. Not the familiar sight of my quiet cul-de-sac, the warm glow of streetlights, the neat rows of parked cars. Instead, a solid, impenetrable wall of fog pressed against the doorway, a swirling, oily mist that seemed to absorb the light from Mark's phone, reflecting nothing back but a dull, gray emptiness. It was so thick it looked almost solid, and it carried with it a smell that made my stomach lurch. The smell of freshly turned soil, of rot, of that same coppery blood, and underneath it all, the faint, sweet scent of Sarah's perfume, Chanel Mademoiselle, a ghostly ribbon woven through the stench. What the hell? Leo breathed, reaching a hand out tentatively into the fog. He jerked it back immediately with a sharp cry, shaking his fingers as if they'd been burned. "It's cold," he stammered, like dry ice. "It hurts." From deep within the house, from the hallway, the laughter started again, echoing off the walls, seeming to come from everywhere at once. A door creaked open slowly, my bedroom door. Then a soft, rhythmic thump, thump, thump began, the sound of someone or something gently bouncing a ball. The sound was mundane, childish, and it was utterly soul-destroyingly terrifying. "The back door," Mark said, his voice tight with a desperation he was barely containing. "The kitchen." We moved as a single, terrified unit, a four-legged creature of pure fear, shuffling through the wreckage of my living room. I supported Chloe, who was barely walking, her feet dragging. Mark led with his phone, its light a pathetic beacon in the overwhelming dark. Leo brought up the rear, his head on a swivel, watching the black emptiness of the hallway behind us. The kitchen felt miles away. Every shadow seemed to writhe and twist. The thump, thump, thump from the back of the house continued, a taunting rhythm. As we passed the entrance to the dining room, a cold draft washed over us, and the whispering started again, not the chaotic rustle from before, but a single, clear voice, Sarah's voice, filled with a desperate urgency. "He's lying. Don't listen. The hands, look at the hands." The voice faded into a sob as we pushed into the kitchen. The back door was there, a simple pane of glass looking out onto my small, fenced yard. Or it should have been. Now it was just another sheet of that same swirling, hungry fog, pressing against the glass, obscuring everything. Mark didn't hesitate. He grabbed a cast-iron skillet from the stove and swung it at the window. The impact should have shattered the glass into 1,000 pieces. Instead, it made a dull, muffled thud, as if he'd struck a sack of wet sand. The fog outside didn't even ripple. He hit it again, harder, grunting with the effort. Same result. The window was unchanged. It was no longer an exit. It was a barrier. From the living room, the bouncing ball stopped. The silence that followed was worse. Then a new sound. A drip. Slow. Deliberate. Drip, drip, drip. It was coming from the sink. I looked over. The faucet was off, but from its spout, a thick, dark liquid was welling up and falling in steady drops into the stainless steel basin. It wasn't water. It was blood. It began to flow faster, a viscous stream that quickly began to fill the sink, the metallic smell flooding the small kitchen. Chloe moaned, her eyes rolling back in her head, and she sagged against me. Leo was hyperventilating, leaning against the refrigerator, his hands gripping his hair. "This isn't happening, this isn't happening," he chanted. Mark just stared at the overflowing sink, the blood now spilling over the edge and onto the tile floor, a spreading dark pool. The laughter echoed from the hallway again, closer this time. The thing was coming back. "The phone," I gasped, the thought finally piercing my panic. "Call the police. Call anyone." Mark fumbled with his phone, his blood-smeared fingers slipping on the screen. He cursed, wiped his hand on his jeans, and tried again. He held it up, his face collapsing. No service. No bars. Nothing. He dialed 911 anyway, putting it on speaker. Instead of a ringtone, a low, droning hum emanated from the speaker, a sound that slowly resolved into a multitude of whispered, overlapping voices, all saying the same thing, over and over. Too late, he's here, he's here." Mark dropped the phone as if it had burned him. It clattered to the bloody floor, the whispers continuing to spill from it, fainter now. We were trapped, completely and utterly trapped in my own house, which was no longer my house, but a haunted, bleeding prison. The door to the kitchen, the one that led back to the living room, began to swing slowly shut with a long, drawn-out creak. We all watched it, paralyzed, as it closed with a soft, definitive click. The lock engaged by itself. We were sealed in, and then the lights in the kitchen flickered once, twice, and buzzed to life. The sudden, blinding fluorescence was almost as shocking as the darkness had been. We all flinched, shielding our eyes. The overhead light was harsh, unforgiving, illuminating the bloody sink, the pool on the floor, our own terrified, pale faces. The fog was still pressed against the window, a churning gray wall. And sitting at the kitchen table, which had been empty a moment before, was Ben. He was just sitting there in his usual chair, his hands resting palms up on the table. The bleeding had stopped. He looked normal, tired, sad, but normal. The malevolent light was gone from his eyes. He looked at us, his expression one of profound confusion and fear. "Guys," he said, and his voice was his own, weak and shaky. "Well, what's happening?" I blacked out. I had a nightmare. He looked down at his blood-crusted hands, his eyes widening in genuine horror. "What is this? What did I do?" For a second, a treacherous, desperate second, hope flared in my chest. It was Ben. Our Ben. He was back. The thing was gone. Leo took a hesitant step forward. "Ben, is that you?" Ben looked up, tears welling in his eyes. "Leo? Man, I'm so scared. I don't know what's going on. I remember the board, and then nothing. Just pain." He held up his hands. "What happened to me?" He sounded so lost, so broken. My grip on Chloe loosened slightly. Mark's shoulders slumped in relief. The nightmare was receding. We had our friend back. We could figure this out together. And then Ben's eyes, full of tears, locked with mine. And in their depths, for just a flicker, I saw it. A cold, sharp glint of amusement. A lie. It was a performance. A perfect, cruel mimicry. Before I could shout a warning, before I could even open my mouth, his expression shifted back to one of pitiable fear. "My head," he moaned, lowering his face into his hands. "It hurts so much." Story number 5. The screen was a void of static, a hissing, gray emptiness that had been my world for the last 17 minutes. Ever since the feed cut from that final, gut-wrenching shot of Leo's face, contorted in a silent scream. His body yanked backwards into the impenetrable blackness of the master bedroom on the second floor of the old Blackwood house. The camera he'd so meticulously mounted on his helmet offering one last dizzying, nauseating spin of rotting floorboards and peeling wallpaper before it. Clattered to the ground, lens facing the dust-choked baseboard, and then nothing, just this infernal electric hum, this blank slate that held the entire Twitch chat, all 12,743 of us, utterly captive, our own messages frozen mid-panic, our collective breath held, waiting for a sign, any sign, that this was all some horrifically elaborate bit, a masterstroke of performance art from a streamer known for his over-the-top stunts. But the silence, the sheer duration of this empty, screaming static, was beginning to erode that hope, replacing it with a cold, leaden dread that sat in the pit of my stomach like a stone. Because I had been there from the very beginning, from the moment Leo, Spectre Seeker, Vance had flashed that winning, gap-toothed grin into his high-definition webcam, his face illuminated by the cool blue light of his gaming rig. The familiar posters of classic horror films and band logos a comforting backdrop in his otherwise pristine streaming den, his energy infectious as. He hiked up the chat about tonight's special, one-time-only event. "All right, my beautiful spooky weirdos, buckle the hell up," he'd announced, his voice a familiar, warm baritone that felt like talking to an old friend. "Tonight, we're doing something different, something raw, something completely unscripted. No green screens, no pre-recorded spooky sounds, just me, this camera, and the most legitimately haunted house in the entire state, maybe the entire country, the infamous Blackwood house out on Route 9. The chat had exploded with hype, with donations and bits lighting up the screen like a digital fireworks display, subscribers renewing just for this event, the viewer count climbing from his usual 10,000 to over 50, then 70, then 100,000, a number that would have made any streamer giddy. But Leo had remained focused, a serious glint in his eye that I now realize wasn't just for show. "Now, you all know I'm a skeptic," he'd continued, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "I think most of this stuff is bullshit, but the history on this place, it's heavy. Built in 1880 by Alistair Blackwood, a reclusive industrialist who, according to the stories, was deep into some seriously dark occult practices. The family died here, all of them, under mysterious circumstances. The house passed through a few hands over the decades, every single family reporting the same things. Cold spots, voices whispering from empty rooms, the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor upstairs. The last owners, the Millers, they just vanished. Poof. Gone. Left everything behind. Clothes in the closets, food on the table, a car in the garage. The police investigation went nowhere. The house has been empty for 20 years, and tonight, thanks to a little creative borrowing of the keys from a friend in the county clerk's office, he'd jangled a set of old, rusty keys on screen. We're going in. Live. For the next 6 hours, or until my battery dies, or until I get chased out by some pissed-off ghost. You're all coming with me." He'd held up a powerful-looking flashlight and a backpack filled with extra batteries, power banks, and a second camera as a backup. "This is the real deal, chat. No cuts, no edits. What happens, happens." And with that, he'd grabbed his car keys, ended the stream from his studio, and promised to go live again the moment he arrived on location. I remember the palpable shift in atmosphere 2 hours later when his stream resumed. The video quality shifting from the crisp clarity of his home setup to the slightly grainier, more dynamic feed of his head-mounted GoPro. The audio filled with the sound of crickets and the rustle of a stiff night wind. He was standing before the house, a monstrous, Gothic revival structure silhouetted against a moonless sky, its angles all wrong, the roof sagging in the middle like a broken spine, the windows boarded up with thick, weather-beaten plywood, looking less like a house and more like a tomb. "Jesus," Leo whispered, his breath misting in the cold air, the microphone picking up the slight chatter of his teeth. "Pictures do not do this place justice. The air is freezing out here, and I'm not just saying that. It's like a good 20 degrees colder than it was in town." He panned the camera slowly, letting us take in the overgrown yard, the skeletal remains of a child's swing set rusting off to the side, the sense of profound isolation. "All right, let's find a way in. The front door is chained shut, but my guy said the back kitchen door might be. Yeah, look at this." The camera view jostled as he trudged through waist-high weeds, the light from his flashlight beam bouncing erratically, illuminating glimpses of broken bottles, a discarded doll with no eyes, the carcass of some small animal. He rounded the corner to the back of the house, and there it was, a heavy-looking door, slightly ajar, one of its hinges broken, as if it had been forced open from the inside. "Jackpot," he murmured, and the chat, myself included, went wild with a mixture of excitement and fear, spamming "Don't Do It Leo" and Geo back alongside YOLO and Ghost Time. He pushed the door open with a foot, the creak of the old wood echoing unnaturally loud in the silent night, and stepped inside. The interior was a time capsule of decay. The kitchen was a disaster of overturned chairs, cabinets hanging open, their contents, old cans of food, jars of unidentifiable preserves, shattered on the floor, covered in a thick layer of dust and grime. The air was stale, thick with the smell of mold, damp earth, and something else, something faintly metallic, like old copper. "You guys getting this?" Leo whispered, his voice hushed now, the bravado from earlier replaced with a genuine, palpable tension. "The atmosphere in here is oppressive. It's hard to explain, but it feels like the air itself is heavy." He moved slowly through the kitchen into a dining room, the flashlight beam sweeping across a long table still set with fine china, now coated in gray dust, a grand chandelier hanging precariously above, missing several of its crystals. It was here that the first strange thing happened. As Leo was describing the table setting, his light flickered, not a power drain flicker, but a fast, stuttering blink like a camera flash. He stopped talking. "Whoa, you see that? My light just..." And then from somewhere deep within the house, upstairs, came a sound. A single distinct thud. Heavy, deliberate, like a large sack of grain being dropped on the floor. The chat exploded. Leo froze, his breathing the only sound on the stream for a long moment. "Okay," he said, his voice tight. "Okay." That was probably the house settling. Old houses make noises, right? But he didn't sound convinced. He continued his exploration, moving into a grand foyer with a staircase sweeping up to the second floor, its once elegant banister now splintered and broken in places. He panned the camera up the staircase into the waiting darkness above. "That's where we're headed eventually," he said, "but let's clear the ground floor first." The living room was next, a cavernous space dominated by a massive stone fireplace, its mantelpiece adorned with faded, water-stained photographs in tarnished silver frames. Leo moved closer to examine them, his flashlight beam illuminating the stern, unsmiling faces of the Blackwood family. Alistair, with his fierce, dark eyes and imposing beard. His wife, a pale, delicate woman who looked haunted even in the photograph. And their two children, a boy and a girl, their expressions blank, almost vacant. "Creepy," Leo commented, but as he moved the light away from the last photo, the little girl, something happened. For a single frame, less than a second, the image in the photograph seemed to shift, the girl's head tilting, her eyes seeming to track the movement of the light. The chat saw it immediately, a flood of "rewind that," and "did you see it?" and "holy shit," the picture moved, scrolling by at a frantic pace. Leo, focused on moving forward, missed it. "Guys, my battery is already draining faster than it should," he said, his voice laced with a new concern. It's like the cold is sucking the life out of it. I've got my power bank, but still. Weird." He moved into a study, shelves lined with mildewed books, a large oak desk sitting in the center of the room. It was here that the first real interaction occurred. Leo was examining a large, leather-bound book on the desk, its pages filled with intricate, hand-drawn symbols and diagrams, a language that looked ancient and malevolent. "This is some seriously dark stuff," he murmured, tracing a gloved finger over a particularly complex sigil. "This looks like..." He was cut off by the sound of a door slamming shut elsewhere in the house. Not a casual bang, but a violent, explosive crack that echoed through the silent rooms. Leo jumped, his heart hammering loud enough for the microphone to pick up. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, spinning around, his light cutting through the darkness of the study towards the open door. The chat was in a frenzy. He slowly crept back out into the foyer. The front door, which he had noted was chained and locked from the outside, was now wide open, swinging gently on its hinges as if someone had just burst through it. But there was no one there, just the empty, dark doorway leading out to the overgrown front yard. "No way," Leo breathed, his voice trembling now. "No fucking way. That door was sealed. I checked it." He walked over to it, shining his light on the heavy chain and padlock, which now hung unbroken from the hasp. It had been unlocked. From the inside. "Someone is here," he said, and the fear in his voice was no longer performative. It was raw, real, and it infected all of us watching. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing through the empty halls. "Is someone there?" Only silence answered him. This was the intermission, the slow, dreadful build where we, the audience, became aware of the danger before the protagonist did. Leo, shaken, decided it was time to go upstairs. "I don't like this," he admitted to the camera to us. "Something feels really wrong. But we're here. We have to see it through." The staircase groaned under his weight, each step a protest of ancient wood. The second floor landing was a long hallway, doors lining either side, all of them closed. The air was even colder up here, the smell of dampness stronger, mixed with that coppery scent, which was now unmistakable. The smell of blood, old and dried but potent. He tried the first door on the right. A bathroom. The tub was stained a deep, ugly brown, the mirror above the sink cracked. The next door, a child's bedroom. Faded rocket ship wallpaper, a small bed with a moldy mattress, a stuffed bear sitting in the corner, one button eye missing. It was in this room that the shadow first appeared. Leo was examining the bear, making a sad comment about the children who lived here, when a long, distorted shadow stretched across the wall behind him, cast from the hallway outside the door. It was tall, too tall, and its shape was wrong. It seemed to have too many limbs, its head elongated and misshapen. The chat saw it instantly. "Behind you." "Leo, look out." "There's something in the hall," flooded the screen. Leo, focused on the bear, didn't see the shadow recede. He turned back to the door. "Nothing in here," he said, and moved back into the hallway. He continued down the hall, the chat's warning scrolling by, unseen and unread by him, a chorus of helpless terror. He paused at the last door on the left. "This must be the master bedroom," he whispered, "the source of most of the stories." The door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open. The room was large, dominated by a massive four-poster bed, its curtains moth-eaten and hanging in tatters. An old vanity sat against one wall, its mirror cloudy and dark. In the corner, an old-fashioned baby's crib, the kind with tall, spindly bars. The room was freezing, a deep, penetrating cold that seemed to leach right through the camera lens. Leo's breath plumed thickly in the air. "My God, it's cold in here," he stammered, his words coming out in shivers. This was it, the peak, the moment everything escalated beyond any possible denial. He stepped fully into the room, his flashlight beam dancing over the dusty furniture. And then the door behind him slammed shut with a force that shook the entire frame. Leo yelled, spinning around, yanking on the doorknob. It was locked. Solid. "Shit! Shit!" he yelled, pounding on the door. The chat was a solid wall of panic, emojis of screaming faces, pleas for him to get out. And then the whispering started. It was faint at first, a multi-layered, guttural sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, rising from the very floorboards, dripping from the ceiling. It was the sound of many voices speaking as one, a chorus of anguish and malice. The microphone strained to pick it up, but the words were clear, echoing in the frozen air. "Get out, get out, get out, too late." Leo was hyperventilating now, his back against the door, his flashlight beam shaking violently as he swept it around the room. "Who's there?" he screamed, his voice cracking with pure, undiluted terror. "What do you want?" The temperature plummeted further. Frost began to spiderweb across the camera lens. And then we saw it. In the far corner of the room, in the darkness behind the crib, a shape began to coalesce. It was a figure, tall and emaciated, its limbs too long and thin, its skin a pale, waxy gray. It had no discernible face, just a smooth, blank expanse of flesh where its features should be. It began to move towards him, not walking, but gliding, its movements unnaturally smooth and silent. Leo saw it. His scream was primal, a sound of utter, soul-crushing horror I will never forget. He fumbled in his backpack, pulling out a large hunting knife he'd brought for protection, holding it out with a shaking hand. "Stay back!" he shrieked. "Stay the fuck away from me!" The entity didn't stop. It glided closer, until it was just a few feet from him. And then its head, that smooth, blank oval, began to change. Features began to press out from within, not the features of one person, but a shifting, melting nightmare of faces. Alistair Blackwood's fierce glare, the wife's terrified scream, the children's blank stares, all swirling and merging on that terrible, pale canvas. Its arm, long and spindly, reached out towards Leo, not to touch him, to point. It pointed a single, bony finger past him, towards the vanity mirror. Leo, mesmerized by sheer terror, slowly turned his head to look. The chat looked with him. In the cloudy, dark glass of the mirror, we didn't see the reflection of the room. We saw a different scene altogether. We saw Leo, on his knees in the center of the room, surrounded by four shadowy figures, their hands on him, holding him down. And we saw a fifth figure, holding a long, cruel-looking knife. The image was grainy, flickering like an old film reel, but it was horrifyingly clear. Leo whimpered, understanding dawning on him, the knife dropping from his limp fingers and clattering on the floor. This wasn't a haunting. It was a recording, a replay, and he was now a part of it. The entity in the room with him let out a sound that wasn't a sound, a psychic wave of pure hatred that distorted the audio feed into a screech of static. The camera feed shuddered. The flashlight died. For 3 seconds, there was pure, absolute blackness and a screeching whine. When the night vision on the GoPro finally kicked in, bathing the world in a hellish green glow. The entity was gone. Leo was alone in the room, on his knees, sobbing with relief. "It's gone," he choked out, a hysterical laugh bubbling up from his throat. "Chat, it's gone. It's over." But we could see what he couldn't. In the green-tinted gloom, standing directly behind him, were 4 more of the faceless figures. And they were not alone. The shadows in the room were moving, peeling themselves away from the walls, taking on the same tall, thin forms. Dozens of them, silent, watching. The chat tried to warn him. Our message is a futile, desperate river of "they're behind you," and "run, Leo, run." But it was too late. One of the figures directly behind him reached out its long, spindly fingers and gently, almost tenderly, placed its hands on either side of his head. Leo's relieved sobs cut off instantly. His body went rigid. His head was slowly, inexorably turned to look behind him. He came face to face with the silent congregation of entities. His mouth opened in a silent scream of absolute, paradigm-shattering terror. A scream that held the realization of every bad dream and every childhood fear made manifest. And then they were on him. The feed became a chaotic, nauseating jumble of green-hued limbs and shifting shadows. There was no sound of a struggle, no screams, just the rustle of clothing and the sickening, wet sounds of things I cannot and will not describe. His body was dragged, limp and boneless, into the center of the room, into the exact spot we had seen in the mirror. The camera, knocked from his head during the struggle, skittered across the floorboards and came to rest facing the baseboard, its view limited to a sliver of the room, showing only the rotten floorboards and the legs of the old crib. The audio, however, remained crystal clear. For a full minute, there was nothing but the sound of soft, shuffling footsteps moving around the room, and a low, rhythmic chanting in that same multi-voiced, guttural whisper. Then a single wet, final thud. And then silence. That was 17 minutes ago. 17 minutes of this gray, static void. 17 minutes of a chat that had gone from frantic to pleading to, finally, silent itself. All 100,000 plus of us just waiting, staring into the void, listening to the empty hiss. Our minds unable to process what we had just witnessed, hoping against hope for a sign that it wasn't real. And then the static crackles. The screen remains gray, but the audio changes. The hiss diminishes, replaced by the faint sound of breathing. Slow, steady, calm breathing, right into the microphone. It's not Leo's breathing. This is different. Lighter. Higher. Almost playful. A voice, a child's voice, a little girl's voice, sweet and clear and dripping with a malice, so profound it feels like a physical blow. Whispers directly into the mic, each word perfectly enunciated. A venomous secret shared with every single one of us watching. A promise etched into the very fabric of our souls. "You're next, chat." The stream instantly cuts to black. The channel, Spectre Seeker, is gone. Deleted. As if it never existed. And I am left alone in the glow of my monitor, in the silence of my room, the echo of that sweet, evil whisper ringing in my ears. And I know, with a certainty that has frozen the very blood in my veins, that it wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. She knows where I live. She knows who I am. She saw me watching. And she's coming. The silence in my room is no longer just an absence of sound. It's a presence, a thick, suffocating entity that presses in on me from all sides, magnified 1,000-fold by the memory of that voice. A voice that bypassed my ears and slithered directly into the core of my brain, coiling around my spine like a venomous serpent. And I can't move. I'm paralyzed in my gaming chair, my fingers still frozen over the keyboard, my eyes wide and unblinking, staring at the Twitch homepage where Spectre Seeker's channel once was, now just a blank, a void, a digital grave marker, and the rational part of my mind, the part that clings to science and logic and the comforting glow of my computer's hardware, is screaming that it was a hoax, a brilliantly orchestrated piece of performance art, a viral marketing stunt for some new horror movie, that Leo is probably laughing right now with his friends, counting his donations, but that rational voice is tiny, a pathetic whisper drowned out by the roaring, icy tsunami of primal fear that little girl's voice unleashed. because it wasn't just the words, it was the way she said them, the intimate, knowing, predatory cadence, the way she lingered on the S in next, a soft, sibilant hiss that promised unimaginable suffering. And the chat wasn't a collective noun. It was personal, it was directed, it was a finger pointing through the screen directly at me, at all of us who were witnesses, who saw what we were never meant to see, and my heart is hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird trying to escape a cage, a frantic, painful rhythm that echoes in the dead quiet of my apartment. And I realize I've been holding my breath, my lungs burning for air, and I finally gasp, the sound shockingly loud in the stillness, and I lurch forward, my hands trembling so violently I can barely type, my fingers slipping off the keys as I frantically open a new browser tab, my movements jerky and uncoordinated, and I type Spectre Seeker into the search bar, hitting enter with a force that nearly cracks the key. But the results are just old clips from weeks ago, highlights of him playing games, reacting to videos, nothing about tonight, nothing about Blackwood House, and I try Twitch streamer disappears live. But the results are just generic news articles about internet safety, nothing current, nothing real, and a cold dread, colder than the air in that cursed bedroom, begins to seep into my bones because it's like it never happened, like it was erased from existence. But I know it happened. I was there, I saw it, I heard it, and the need for confirmation, for the solace of shared terror, is overwhelming. So I navigate to the Discord server for his community, the Spooky Weirdos, a server usually buzzing with memes and chatter and theories. But as the channel loads, the silence is deafening. The general chat is a torrent of messages, hundreds of them a minute, a waterfall of pure, unadulterated panic people, asking if anyone else saw it, if their stream cut out too, if they heard the voice, the words blurring together into a single screaming entity of collective trauma. And I see usernames I recognize, people I've chatted with for months, all expressing the same soul-crushing fear, the same paralyzing confusion. And it's both a comfort and a confirmation that makes my stomach lurch, because we all saw it, we all heard it, it was real, it was shared. And then a user named Shadow Watcher posts a screen recording, a 2-minute clip from the very end, from the static and then the voice, and the chat explodes again, people begging them to take it down, others demanding they send it to them. And I private message Shadow Watcher, my fingers fumbling over the keys, typing, "Please send me the clip." And they respond instantly, a simple file transfer, and I download it with a sense of morbid, terrifying obligation. And I open it, the video player window small on my screen, and I hit play, and there it is again, the gray static, the hiss, and I have to force myself to breathe, to not look away. And then the breathing starts, that slow, calm, alien inhalation and exhalation. And then the voice, your next chat. And even though I'm expecting it, the effect is undiminished, a physical jolt that goes through me like an electric shock. And I have to pause the video, my hand shaking too much to control the mouse, and I sit there, breathing raggedly, staring at the paused frame of gray nothingness, and I know with a certainty that feels like a death sentence, that this is not over, that something has been unleashed, a door has been opened, and we, the audience, are now part of the show, and the rules have changed, and the fear is no longer a spectator sport. It's a contagion, and we are all infected, and my eyes are drawn to the dark corners of my room, to the space behind my door, to the closet with its door slightly ajar, and every shadow seems deeper, more substantive, holding a potential shape within it, and the familiar comfort of my own space is gone, replaced by a landscape of lurking threats. And I keep replaying those final moments in my head, the way the entities moved, the silent, efficient horror of it, the utter lack of struggle, as if Leo's will, his very essence, had been simply deleted before his body was taken. And I think of the little girl's voice, so sweet and so vile, and I wonder whose voice it was, which of the Blackwood children, and what they want, why they are still there.